Australia, a continent so vast that it feels like its own planet, where endless red deserts meet lush coastlines and silence stretches further than the horizon. Yet for all its size, almost everyone lives in just a few small corners of it. Tonight, we're taking a slow journey through this curious contrast, the story of why nearly all of Australia is empty, and why life clings so closely to its shimmering edges. Welcome to the Sleepy Geographer, a place to drift through the world's wonders, one calm thought at a time. Wherever you're listening from, I'd love to know, what part of the world are you in right now? It's always fascinating to see just how far this quiet corner of YouTube reaches. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations, a gentle like on the video, or a quick tap on subscribe really helps the channel drift a little further each night. And if you're already subscribed, thank you for being part of this sleepy little expedition. Now, I do hope this video isn't too interesting and keeps you awake, but if it does, at least you'll wake up a little wiser about Australia's hidden geography. So why does an entire continent lie mostly untouched? And what does that say about how people and landscapes choose each other? Australia has been called a land of edges, a continent where life gathers where the water meets the sea, and where the interior, vast and ancient, lies largely undisturbed. To understand why, you have to look at the continent itself, not just its people, but the land beneath them, the air above, and the rhythms that have shaped both for millions of years. This story begins long before cities like Sydney or Melbourne appeared on the map. Australia's landscape is one of the oldest on Earth, worn low by time, eroded to soft hills and sprawling plains. Over hundreds of millions of years, weather and wind have stripped it bare, leaving soils poor, rivers short, and deserts wide. The Great Dividing Range on the east catches what little rain drifts inland, while the rest of the continent lies under skies that seldom open. The climate is ruled by invisible patterns, great loops of air that rise and fall in predictable cycles. The same dry descending air that gives the Sahara its sand dunes also keeps much of Australia parched. And where water is rare, so too is settlement. People have always followed the rivers, the rains and the coasts, the narrow bands where life can flourish. Yet the idea of emptiness is misleading. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples have lived across this continent, moving with its seasons, reading its subtle signs, and shaping its ecology with care. To call the centre of Australia empty is to overlook one of the oldest, most enduring relationships between land and people anywhere on Earth. What European settlers saw as desolation was, in fact, a landscape finely tuned to survival, a place where fire, drought and renewal danced together in balance. When cities eventually grew, they did so where the conditions were kindest. Harbours that opened to the world, climates that offered moderation, and soil just fertile enough to sustain growth. Over time, the pattern only deepened. The coast became denser, the interior quieter. The heart of the continent remained vast and still, while the edges shimmered with light and life. In this journey, we'll wander from the ancient bones of the continent to the bright ribbons of its cities, tracing how climate, geology and history have drawn almost an entire nation to just a few precious places. Because to understand why 97% of Australia is almost empty, you first have to understand what empty really means. Australia's landscape is so old that in geological terms it is almost retired. While much of the world is still rumbling with earthquakes, volcanoes and freshly built mountains, Australia sits quietly, a weathered veteran of deep time. It is a continent of remarkable stillness, where the land has not so much grown as slowly worn away, grain by grain, under the endless sun. To understand this calm surface, it helps to picture the foundation beneath it, the ancient cratons that make up the heart of the continent. These are slabs of continental crust that have survived since the early chapters of Earth's story, stretching back over 3 billion years. The Yilgarn Craton in Western Australia, for example, was already old when multicellular life first appeared in the oceans. These rocks have been folded, uplifted, drowned and exhumed many times over, yet they remain stable, the quiet spine of the continent. They form a kind of geological arc, carrying minerals, fossils and scars from almost every major phase of Earth's evolution. Unlike continents born of violence, Australia has spent most of its recent history adrift and at peace. When the supercontinent Gondwana broke apart around 180 million years ago, Australia began to drift northward, slowly escaping the chill of Antarctica. Since then, it has moved at a leisurely pace, about the speed fingernails grow, gliding across tectonic plates like a raft of stone. Without the collision of plates to crumple it into mountain chains, erosion took over as the dominant sculptor. The result is a land that has been smoothed rather than shaped, a continent that has exhaled for millions of years. The most striking evidence of this age is how flat it all is. Australia's average elevation is only a few hundred metres above sea level, making it the lowest of all inhabited continents. But within that flatness lies extraordinary subtlety. A single ridge may mark what was once a mighty mountain range. A shallow basin might be the remnant of an ancient inland sea. Over time, weathering, the slow chemical and physical breakdown of rock, has ground these features down into gentle rises and vast plains. Iron oxides left behind by this process tint the soil in hues of red, orange and ochre, painting the land in colours that shift with the light. Among the few places that still rise boldly from the horizon is the Great Dividing Range. Running for over 3,000 kilometres along the continent's eastern edge, it forms a ragged backbone separating the lush coastal strip from the drier interior. Despite its grand name, this range is not especially high. It's more of a long, rolling uplift than a chain of peaks, a reminder that in Australia, even the mountains have grown old gracefully. The Great Dividing Range is crucial though, because it determines where the rain falls. Moist air from the Pacific is forced upward along its slopes, cooling and releasing rain on the seaward side. The inland air, now dry, sinks again, giving birth to the arid heart of the continent. That interplay between altitude and air has been steering Australia's climate for millions of years. The rivers that begin as trickling streams in the highlands often vanish long before reaching the sea, swallowed by thirsty soils and evaporation. Unlike the mighty glacier-fed rivers of other continents, Australian waterways tend to be short, unreliable, and seasonal, more a suggestion than a certainty. The Darling, the Murrumbidgee, the Cooper Creek. These are rivers that ebb and disappear, leaving cracked channels that may wait years for another flow. It's not just the dryness of the air that causes this, but also the ancient low-relief surface. Without sharp gradients or high mountains to drive strong currents, water meanders slowly, pooling in salt lakes or sinking underground. The flatness also plays a quiet role in how the land stores and releases life. Because the soils are so ancient, they are thin and nutrient poor. Over endless ages, rain and wind have leached away the minerals that crops depend on. This is why even when there is water, farming can be difficult. Plants and animals have adapted in remarkable ways, tough grasses, deep-rooted shrubs, and creatures that can survive months between rains. But for people, it means the landscape is more a test of patience than abundance. The ground has had so long to weather that in many regions, it is essentially the dust of former mountains. Still, there's beauty in that stillness. Stand in central Australia, and the land seems to breathe slowly. The horizons stretch without interruption, and the light changes more than the terrain does. Rocks once buried miles deep now sit exposed under a vast sky, revealing ancient patterns, cross-bedded sandstones, wave ripples from vanished seas, and crystals that formed in the heat of forgotten magma chambers. In a way, the ground itself is a geological museum, each grain telling a story billions of years in the making. This age has also made the continent rich in minerals. Iron ore, gold, copper, and bauxite lie close to the surface, the legacy of a planet's long patience. Because the erosion has done most of the excavation already, mining companies often find treasures waiting near the topsoil. The very processes that make Australia flat and dry have also made it one of the world's great mining powers, an irony not lost on geologists, who often joke that Australia's main export is its own deep history. All this slow wearing down has another consequence. There's little natural rejuvenation. In younger, more tectonically active continents, mountains rise, rocks fracture, and fresh minerals enter the soil. But in Australia, with its stable base and lack of major uplift, that renewal has largely stopped. The land has entered a kind of graceful geological retirement, not dead but unhurried. Its energy lies not in growth but in endurance. Over the millennia, this patient erosion has created a particular kind of beauty, subtle, muted, and vast. The shapes of the land are soft, but the story behind them is immense. From the cratons that hold the planet's oldest rocks to the Great Dividing Range that still teases rain from the ocean air, Australia's form is a portrait of time itself. And when you look at it from above, the red centre fading into pale coastal greens, it's hard not to feel that the land has earned its quiet. It has been everything: mountain, seafloor, desert, and a plain. What remains is the calm after the storm of creation, a continent so ancient that it has learned to simply rest beneath the sun. If the land is Australia's ancient stage, then the air above it is the restless actor deciding where the spotlight falls. The shape of the continent explains where the water could go, but it's the atmosphere that decides whether it ever arrives at all. Every cloud, gust, and drop of rain is part of an immense, invisible machine that circles the planet, one that leaves the heart of Australia almost entirely untouched. High above the equator, the sun's heat sends air surging upward. Warm air rises, cools, and releases its moisture in tropical downpours. That air, now dry and light, then drifts towards the poles before sinking again at around 30 degrees latitude, right where much of Australia sits. This descending branch of circulation is known as the Hadley Cell, and it's the reason Australia, like the Sahara or the Kalahari, carries vast deserts beneath bright blue skies. The air that descends here has already lost its moisture near the equator. When it sinks, it warms further, creating zones of high pressure that smother clouds before they can properly form. These high-pressure belts are called the subtropical highs, and they rule the Australian climate like quiet monarchs. They drift north and south with the seasons, expanding in the long dry months, retreating slightly in summer, but never straying far. Beneath them, the sky is usually clear, the humidity low, and the ground hot enough to shimmer by midday. Rainfall becomes a rare guest, welcome when it appears, and quickly missed when it leaves. For much of the interior, this pattern is remarkably consistent. The air moves in slow circular motions, down, out, and back up, creating a dome of stillness, while other parts of the world build weather fronts that sweep through with drama. Much of inland Australia simply waits. It's a land of half-promises, where a cloud may appear on the horizon, drift lazily forward, and then evaporate as if it changed its mind. If clouds could keep diaries, theirs would read, penciled in, then erased. Closer to the coasts, the story changes slightly. The trade winds, steady east to west breezes born from the turning of the earth, bring moisture from the Pacific to the northeastern shores. That's why places like Cairns and the Daintree rainforest receive generous rainfall, while the outback bakes under blue emptiness. The Great Dividing Range plays the role of gatekeeper, forcing the moist air to rise, cool, and drop its burden of rain before it ever reaches the inland plains. On the far side, the air descends again, now thirsty for moisture, drying everything in its path. This is the rain shadow effect, a simple but powerful reason why Australia's coasts are green, while its centre glows red. Further south, another actor joins the stage, the roaring 40s, strong westerly winds that circle the Southern Ocean. These winds batter the southern coastlines, bringing cool air and unpredictable weather to regions like Tasmania and Victoria. But their energy fades as they move inland, leaving Central Australia mostly untouched by their turbulence. The result is a continent sliced by air, lush, temperate edges, and a vast parched interior. Sometimes, though, the system slips out of rhythm. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, a pattern of ocean and atmospheric changes in the Pacific, can flip Australia's weather between extremes. In El Niño years, the eastern coasts dry out, droughts deepen and rivers shrink. In La Niña years, the trade winds strengthen, dragging more moist air onto the continent, flooding rivers and swelling dams. For people who live here, the difference between too little and too much rain is measured not just in inconvenience, but in survival. Even on still days, the atmosphere is never truly at rest. Heat radiates off the baked earth, lifting warm air in slow spirals. Birds rise on these invisible columns, circling lazily above a world that shimmers like liquid glass. At ground level, the air hums with life, cicadas droning like tiny generators, the sound of heat itself. As evening falls, the temperature drops sharply. Without clouds to hold in the warmth, it escapes back into the sky. That's why desert nights can feel so cold, the air reversing its generosity almost as quickly as it gave it. For thousands of years, people have watched these patterns and learned their moods. Indigenous Australians knew when the wet season would come to the tropics, and when the dry air of the interior would harden the land. They timed movements, ceremonies, and harvests with an understanding of the sky that rivaled any modern meteorologist. Their seasonal calendars, often divided into 5 or 6 subtle seasons instead of 4, reflect how nuanced the air's behaviour truly is. European settlers, arriving from softer, wetter climates, took much longer to understand this invisible architecture. Many early expeditions into the interior failed not because the land was cruel, but because the sky was indifferent. A single failed rain could turn rivers into dust. Wells could vanish into cracks. Explorers often wrote of mirages, shimmering pools that danced away as they approached, illusions created by light bending through layers of hot, dry air. The very atmosphere itself played tricks on them, as if reminding them who was in charge. In truth, it's not hostility, but balance that defines this system. The air gives just enough to sustain life around the edges, then withdraws, preserving the silence of the centre. It's a rhythm so old that even the land seems tuned to it. Plants here don't chase rain, they endure its absence. Animals hide by day and emerge at night when the air softens. The entire ecosystem has learned to move with the atmosphere's slow breath. When a rare storm does roll across the plains, it feels almost theatrical. The smell of wet dust rises like perfume. The air, electric and heavy, carries a tension that builds for hours before finally breaking into thunder. For a brief moment, the continent exhales. Rivers run, frogs call, and the desert blooms. But as quickly as it came, the subtropical high reasserts itself, clearing the stage once more. The clouds vanish, the heat returns, and the cycle continues. Australia's weather is not an accident. It's a masterpiece of air in motion. From the steady trade winds brushing its coasts to the unyielding, high-pressure domes guarding its centre, every breath of wind is part of a larger choreography. The continent's dryness, its vast open spaces, and its empty heart all trace back to these unseen rivers of air that flow endlessly above. The sky over Australia may look calm, but it's a quiet kind of power. one that decides where life can thrive, where it must struggle, and where the land will simply remain as it has for millions of years, still sunlit and waiting. In Australia, water is not just a resource, it is a storyteller. Every river, salt lake, and whisper of thunder carries a chapter of a much larger tale, one written in the language of scarcity and surprise. The rhythm of the continent has always been dictated by how, when, and where water appears, or more often where it doesn't. In this vast landscape, the presence of water feels like a blessing, and its absence like a truth too ancient to argue with. Most rivers in Australia do not behave like those in other parts of the world. They are intermittent, erratic, and unapologetically unpredictable. Some flow only once every few years, then vanish beneath cracked clay. Others change direction across the centuries, carving new paths through the plains as the land tilts and dries. A few, like the Darling and the Cooper Creek, can stretch for thousands of kilometres when swollen, yet dwindle to a chain of waterholes when the rains retreat. They are not rivers of permanence, but of memory, traces of water lingering long after the clouds have passed. Because so much of the continent lies under the watchful eye of the subtropical highs, rainfall is not only scarce but unevenly shared. The northern tropics drown in summer monsoons, while the south enjoys cooler, wetter winters. The centre, however, remains capricious, a place where drought can last for years and then end in a single week of flood. The land has learned to live in extremes, swinging from thirst to abundance and back again. Even the plants seem to wait patiently, their seeds lying dormant until the first hint of moisture stirs them awake. Within days, deserts bloom in colours no one expects from such a barren world. Bursts of violet, yellow and white sweeping across the red earth like spilled paint. Below the surface lies another kind of river, one that never sees the sun. Australia's aquifers, vast underground reservoirs of ancient water, stretch beneath the land like quiet veins. The Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest of its kind on Earth, covers nearly a quarter of the continent. Its water fell as rain more than 1 million years ago, long before humans arrived, and has been slowly circulating ever since. For much of inland Australia, it is the only dependable source of fresh water. Towns, homesteads and cattle stations rely on artesian bores drilled deep into the ground, tapping into this buried ocean. The water that emerges is often warm and mineral-rich, a time capsule of prehistoric rain. But even this hidden lifeline is finite. The more it is drawn, the slower it refills. In some regions, pressure has fallen so much that natural springs have stopped flowing entirely. The balance is delicate. Take too little and the land stays silent. Take too much and it stays silent forever. For indigenous communities, many of these springs are sacred, seen as living beings that breathe water into the desert. To them, the connection between people and groundwater is as much spiritual as it is practical. Every drop carries meaning, and every spring tells a story of persistence. Above ground, the mood of water is mercurial. When the rains finally arrive, they rarely do so politely. The sky darkens, the air thickens, and what was silence becomes sound. Distant thunder rolls across the plains like a drumbeat, and the dry riverbeds, patient for months or even years, come suddenly alive. Floods can move at astonishing speed, sweeping across the landscape in wide, shallow sheets. Within days, they transform the interior. Lakes appear where there were none, and birds arrive seemingly from nowhere, drawn by instincts older than maps. Lake Eyre, or Cutty-Thander, is the best example of this magic. For most of its life, it is a salt-encrusted basin, shining white under the sun. And every few years, when distant rains finally make their long journey south, it fills with water, becoming one of the largest temporary lakes in the world. Fish hatch, plants burst into life, and the desert sings with the sound of wings. Yet just as quickly as it comes, the water leaves. The heat returns, the surface cracks, and the cycle resets. This pattern, the boom and bust of hydrology, defines much of Australia's ecology. Life here has evolved to wait. Frogs bury themselves underground in cocoons, waiting months for the next downpour. Birds migrate thousands of kilometres, following ephemeral wetlands that appear and vanish across the interior. Even the human economy follows these rhythms. In good years, the land seems generous. Crops grow, rivers run, and dams brim. In bad years, the same places turn brittle and unforgiving. Towns that once thrived on flowing water shrink back into stillness. This unpredictability has shaped not only the landscape but the national psyche. Australians often speak of drought and flood as if they were old acquaintances, one harsh, one over-enthusiastic, both familiar. Whole communities have learned to measure time not by the calendar, but by rainfall. A year of good rains becomes a memory retold with the same fondness as a holiday, while a year of drought becomes something to endure and survive together. The country's literature, art and humour all carry traces of this relationship with water, respect, frustration, and awe rolled into one. Even modern engineering, with all its ambition, struggles against the logic of the climate. Dams can hold only what falls, and pipelines can carry only what exists. The idea of diverting northern rivers southward has been proposed many times, but the physics and the costs rarely agree. Evaporation alone steals much of the water before it can travel far. In Australia, water refuses to be tamed. It obeys the sky, not the map. What emerges from all of this is a kind of equilibrium. Not a steady balance, but a repeating dance. The land floods and dries, life withdraws and returns, and people adapt to the pulse. To live here is to accept that control is temporary and that patience is everything. Each drop that falls is part of a system far older than any city or farm. A reminder that this continent breathes through water, even when that breath feels like a sigh. The next time rain sweeps across the desert, the sound you hear is not just weather. It is history returning for a visit, a short, luminous moment in which the land remembers what it is to drink. And when the last puddle disappears under the morning sun, the silence that follows isn't emptiness. It's simply Australia waiting again, as it always has, for the next story carried in the rain. Australia's soil tells a story of endurance rather than abundance. It is beautiful in colour, rich in texture, but poor in almost everything that makes crops thrive. In many ways, the ground itself mirrors the character of the continent. Old, patient, and profoundly weathered. Beneath the vivid reds and ochres lies one of the oldest soil systems on Earth, quietly exhausted by time. Unlike the young volcanic soils of places like New Zealand or Indonesia, which are replenished by fresh minerals from deep within the Earth, Australia's soils have been exposed for tens of millions of years with little geological renewal. The mountains have worn down, the rivers run slow, and the land has been rinsed and scoured by countless seasons of rain and drought. Every drop of water that passes through the ground leaches out a little more of the nutrients plants need: phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, and trace elements like zinc and copper. Over millions of years, this process leaves behind a surface that is chemically impoverished but visually striking. The iron oxides that remain tint the soil into those famous shades of rust and crimson, giving the land its distinctive colour and a quiet beauty that hides its fatigue. This mineral hunger explains a great deal about where life gathers and where it retreats. Much of the continent's vegetation has evolved to cope with scarcity. Eucalypts and acacias thrive not because the soil is generous, but because they have learned to recycle what little they receive. Some native plants form alliances with fungi to reach nutrients locked deep underground. Others grow slowly, conserving energy the way desert animals conserve water. The result is an ecosystem that looks hardy and sparse, but is intricately balanced. Each leaf, root and microbe tuned to survival in thin, tired earth. For farmers, though, this soil presents an endless puzzle. When Europeans first arrived, they saw vast open plains and assumed fertility followed flatness. Early settlers, expecting black, loamy fields like those back home, discovered instead that much of Australia's interior was as stingy as it was spacious. The first crops failed not for lack of effort, but for lack of minerals. Phosphorus deficiency in particular became notorious. It took decades of experimentation and a lot of crushed rock and imported fertilizer to coax consistent yields from the ground. Even today, Australia uses large amounts of phosphate to maintain productivity, a kind of geological repayment for the land's long service. Another quiet challenge lies hidden in the chemistry of the soil itself: salinity. Because Australia is so flat and its rivers so gentle, salts dissolved in groundwater tend to rise toward the surface rather than wash away. When trees are cleared, deep roots that once drew down groundwater disappear, allowing the water table and the salts it carries to creep upward. Over time, this creates pale, crusted patches where little can grow. The effect can spread invisibly, turning productive farmland into shimmering white scars. From the air, they look like frost, but they're a sign of land slowly losing its balance. This phenomenon is ancient too. In the dry centre, natural salt lakes mark where rivers once flowed. As evaporation outpaced rainfall, the dissolved minerals were left behind layer upon layer until the ground itself became a record of vanished water. Walk across such a lake bed, and the surface sparkles as if dusted with glass. Beneath the crust, however, the soil is lifeless, choked with salt. It's a reminder that in Australia, even beauty can come from hardship. Despite all this, the continent is not without its fertile corners. Along the eastern seaboard, younger basaltic soils from long-extinct volcanoes still hold generous nutrients. The Atherton tablelands in Queensland, the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, and the rich volcanic plains of Victoria all owe their productivity to eruptions that occurred millions of years ago but still feed plants today. In the south, river flats and floodplains, replenished by occasional silt, offer small oases of fertility. These are the landscapes that support agriculture: vineyards, grain fields, orchards and pastures, each carefully located where the soil still remembers how to give. Even so, farming in Australia is an act of balance more than dominance. The soils respond best to restraint. Overwork them and they lose their fragile structure. Overwater them and salt rises to the surface. Many farmers have learned to adapt, rotating crops, planting deep-rooted species to stabilize the water table, and managing ground cover to prevent erosion. Modern science has added precision mapping and satellite monitoring, but the basic principle remains unchanged. Take only what the soil can spare, and never mistake colour for fertility. Beyond agriculture, the land's geochemical history continues to shape the nation's identity in subtler ways. The red soils of the interior, glowing beneath the sunset, have become iconic, symbols of endurance, isolation, and quiet grandeur. Artists, travellers, and geologists alike find beauty in the contrast between the land's visual richness and its physical poverty. There's something almost poetic about it. A continent that looks abundant but hides its treasures deep below, in minerals rather than crops. When you stand barefoot on that fine, powdery earth, it's easy to feel the weight of time beneath you. Every grain is a fragment of something older, a remnant of mountains long gone. The land has been refined by ages of wind and rain into a soft, reddish dust that carries the memory of its own creation. In that sense, Australia's soil isn't just tired, it's wise. it has seen everything, nourished life against the odds, and learned the quiet art of persistence. And though it may not give easily, it gives enough. Enough for forests that whisper in the heat, enough for flowers that wait years to bloom, and enough for people who have learned to work with it rather than against it. In the end, the soil's beauty lies not in its generosity, but in its resilience. A reminder that even the most exhausted ground can still sustain life, if treated with patience and respect. Australia may be a continent, but most of its story takes place at the edges. The rim of land where sea meets soil is where nearly everyone lives, works, and dreams. It's where the air feels cooler, the water more forgiving, and the horizon always promises connection rather than isolation. For all its size, Australia's heart beats at the coast. The thin line between blue and brown where geography meets comfort. The coast wins for simple, sensible reasons. It is where water is both abundant and predictable, where the air moves softly rather than scorching, and where life can be sustained without the constant gamble of inland weather. The sea moderates temperature like a vast breathing air conditioner, taking the edge off summer heat and softening winter chill. Stand near the shore, and the difference can be felt almost immediately. The salt air cooler on your skin, the humidity balancing what the desert steals. It's easy to understand why the first settlements stayed where the breezes did, but convenience is only part of it. The coast also offers the kind of geography that humans have always loved. Harbours, river mouths and fertile estuaries. Natural bays such as Sydney Harbour, Port Phillip Bay and the Swan River Inlet in Perth made ideal safe anchorages for ships arriving from half a world away. These same waterways provided access to fresh water, rare and precious in a continent so stingy with rivers. To early settlers, the combination of fresh water and deep anchorage must have felt like finding treasure. Towns became ports, ports became cities, and soon the pattern was set. Trade reinforced that pattern. Australia's distance from other nations meant that almost everything of value had to pass through its coastlines. The continent's first wealth, wool, gold, wheat, minerals, all left by ship. The ports became gateways to the world, and even as railways and highways stitched the country together, the sea remained the main artery of exchange. Today, almost every major Australian city sits on or near the coast. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. Together they hold the vast majority of the population, forming a kind of luminous ring that glows on the satellite images while the interior stays dark and vast. Climate plays its quiet part too. The inland deserts and plains are dramatic but unforgiving. Summer heat can reach the kind of temperatures that make machinery complain and humans retreat indoors. The coastal fringes, by contrast, bask in moderation. Sea breezes cool the afternoons, and rainfall, though still erratic, is enough to keep vegetation green and reservoirs full. Even in cities that sprawl far inland from their ports, such as Brisbane or Perth, the influence of the ocean lingers. The rhythm of tides and the scent of salt water hang in the air, a daily reminder that life here is built on a maritime foundation. There's also the matter of comfort and lifestyle, a more subtle geography of the mind. People naturally gravitate to places where life feels balanced, and the coast offers that illusion of plenty. Beaches provide recreation and beauty, fishing sustains livelihoods, and the ocean horizon has always symbolised freedom and possibility. It's no coincidence that the Aussie dream often comes with sea spray and the sound of gulls in the distance. Even those who live far from the shoreline often speak of it with a kind of longing, as if the coast represents a gentler version of the continent itself. Historically, the coast's appeal wasn't just aesthetics, it was survival. In the early days of colonisation, moving inland meant risk. There were few reliable maps, little understanding of the water systems, and enormous distances between sources of food and shelter. The coastline, meanwhile, offered navigation, communication and safety. Ships could resupply colonies, news could travel and trade could flourish. Over time, this practical preference solidified into a national pattern. Rail lines were laid to link coastal cities to their hinterlands, but rarely to one another. Even today, Australia's population map mirrors its maritime outline almost perfectly. The contrast between edge and centre is so stark that it shapes culture as much as geography. The coast is seen as energetic, modern and outward-looking, the interior as quiet, timeless and remote. This duality has become part of the national identity, the beach as symbol of leisure and openness, the outback as emblem of solitude and endurance. Yet both rely on each other. The interior provides the minerals, grains and the cattle. The coast provides the ports, industries and people to move them. It's an unspoken partnership, though one heavily tilted toward the sea. There's another kind of geography at work too, one of light and sound. On the coast, the air moves with rhythm. Waves crash, gulls cry and wind slides through palms and eucalypts. Inland, silence stretches wide, broken only by wind through grass or the murmur of insects. Humans, it seems, are drawn to motion and sound, to places where change is visible but not chaotic. The coast provides just that, a daily theatre of tide, surf and sky. Over time, the coastal corridor has become not just a population zone, but a cultural spine. The east coast alone forms a nearly continuous chain of settlement running thousands of kilometres from Cairns to Hobart. Highways, airports and fibre optic cables follow its path like arteries feeding the nation. Along this thin strip of land lies almost everything that defines modern Australia. Its economy, its politics, its universities, its art. Step a few hundred kilometres inland and the density drops dramatically, replaced by open land, low voices and long distances. Yet the coast's victory is not absolute. It has its own challenges, erosion, storms and the constant tension between development and preservation. As cities swell and housing creeps closer to the sea, people are reminded that the ocean is both friend and force. Rising tides and stronger cyclones remind coastal dwellers that they too live at the mercy of geography. The sea gives comfort, but it also takes land. Still, for most Australians, the trade is worth it. Few restless nights for the privilege of waking to an open horizon. In the end, the coast wins not because it conquers, but because it welcomes. It offers water where there might be none, winds that soothe instead of scorch, and a connection to the wider world that feels both practical and poetic. From the fishing towns of Western Australia to the harbours of New South Wales, from the coral bays of Queensland to the cool southern inlets of Victoria, life gathers where land meets sea. It's the edge that feeds the centre, the margin that defines the whole. Stand at dawn on any Australian beach and you'll see why. The surf rolls in with quiet persistence, the light ripples across pale sand, and the air carries a freshness that feels like renewal. Behind you lies a continent of silence, before you, the world. The coast, patient and persuasive, always wins. For tens of thousands of years before ships arrived from across the sea, Australia was already known, named, and cared for. The idea that its vast interior was empty could not be further from the truth. Every dune, creek bed, and granite outcrop belonged to a living network of stories and responsibilities. The land was not wilderness but country, a word that, in Indigenous Australian cultures, holds far deeper meaning than geography. Country is family, law, memory and sustenance. It is a world in which people and place are inseparable. Archaeological evidence shows that Aboriginal people have lived on this continent for at least 60,000 years, making theirs one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Over that time, they developed an intricate understanding of the land's moods, its seasons, its hidden waters, and its cycles of renewal. Knowledge was passed not through written records, but through song, ceremony, and story. The landscape itself became the library. Songlines, or dreaming tracks, connected distant regions through shared stories that mapped the roots of ancestral beings. These songs served as both spiritual pathways and practical navigation tools, guiding travellers from one waterhole to another across thousands of kilometres. Each line carried layers of meaning. A verse might describe how a creator's spirit shaped a particular rock formation, while also encoding the direction to the next source of food or shelter. When sung correctly, the song ensured both survival and continuity, a way of keeping the land alive through memory. To walk a songline was to perform geography as living culture. It was a form of navigation far older than the compass, written in melody rather than ink. Across this immense continent, indigenous groups managed their environments with a precision born of experience. Fire, for instance, was not feared but understood as a tool of balance. The practice known as fire stick farming involved lighting small, controlled burns to clear undergrowth and encourage new plant growth and create open corridors for hunting. These mosaic fires prevented the catastrophic wildfires that later settlers would face, while simultaneously shaping habitats for animals like kangaroos and wallabies. The result was a patchwork landscape maintained through rhythm and care, a partnership between humans and ecology rather than domination. This deep custodianship extended to water, the rarest treasure of the continent. In places where rainfall could not be trusted, people knew where to find what was hidden. Rock holes, soaks, and ephemeral creeks were mapped through oral tradition, ensuring that communities could move safely across regions that would appear desolate to outsiders. In desert areas, techniques for collecting and storing water were refined over millennia, digging wells in dry riverbeds, covering them with branches to slow evaporation, and marking their locations with subtle stone arrangements or totemic art. Even the behaviour of birds and insects was read as a guide to water's presence. Nothing was random and nothing forgotten. Mobility was key to survival, but it was never aimless wandering. Movement followed seasonal patterns tied to the flowering of plants, the breeding cycles of animals, and the arrival of rains. Coastal groups fished and foraged along the estuaries during the warm months, while inland communities might travel to ceremonial grounds when conditions allowed. The paths between camps were well established, forming networks of exchange long before roads existed. Trade routes carried ochre, shells, stone tools, and songs, the materials of both economy and identity. This mobility also maintained harmony between groups and the land itself. By rotating the areas they used and allowing places time to rest, Indigenous Australians practiced a form of sustainable land management that modern ecology only later began to articulate. Territories were carefully defined through kinship and language, but they overlapped through mutual respect. The boundaries of country were not barriers but meeting places where stories, marriages, and ceremonies renewed the bonds between people and place. Every region had its own laws, shaped by its particular environment. In the lush tropics of Arnhem Land, knowledge centred around the tides, mangroves, and monsoon cycles. In the arid interior, attention focused on desert winds, animal tracks, and the subtle promise of rain. Far from being static, these knowledge systems evolved as climates shifted and landscapes changed. People adapted without losing continuity, reshaping their stories to match the land's new rhythms. The adaptability itself was a form of resilience, a way of surviving by listening. European explorers, accustomed to dense forests and flowing rivers, often misread what they saw. They described the interior as empty, not realizing that they were walking through a landscape carefully managed for thousands of years. Grasslands they praised for their openness were in fact the result of regular burning. Waterholes they thought lucky to find had been tended and protected for generations. Even the placement of camps often followed ancient logic: shade at certain hours, protection from particular winds, and access to seasonal foods. What seemed spontaneous was, in truth, deliberate. In recent decades, science has begun to catch up with this understanding. Ecologists now recognize traditional burning techniques as essential for biodiversity. Hydrologists study the ancient water networks mapped in oral histories. Archaeologists continue to find evidence of long-term habitation in places once dismissed as unlivable, from the stone houses of Budge Bim in Victoria, dating back thousands of years, to the desert wells of the Western Desert. Each discovery adds depth to the realization that this continent was never empty. It was observed, interpreted, and sustained through unbroken lines of knowledge. Country in the indigenous sense is not a passive landscape but an active relationship. People belong to the land as much as the land belongs to them. Caring for country means maintaining that relationship through ceremony, through fire, through respect. Even today, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities continue this work, combining ancient knowledge with modern science to restore ecosystems and manage natural resources. In doing so, they remind the rest of the world that sustainability is not an invention, but a memory. To walk through the Australian bush with this awareness is to see a different world. What once looked like emptiness becomes pattern and purpose, a fallen branch placed to mark direction, a clearing that feeds wallabies, a scar tree that tells of tools once made and food once gathered. The quiet between sounds is not absence but equilibrium. Every whisper of wind, every flicker of fire carries a story still unfolding. So when people say that most of Australia is empty, perhaps what they mean is that they haven't yet learned how to see it. For those who know country, the land has never been silent. It hums softly with knowledge, a song as old as time itself, still echoing beneath the open ski. The first Australian cities were born not from grand design, but from necessity. Places where ships could anchor, fresh water could be found, and survival felt at least somewhat possible. They began as tiny clusters of tents and crude huts along the coastline, the edges of an unfamiliar continent that stretched endlessly inland. From those fragile beginnings, the modern map of Australia took shape, its population forever drawn toward the sea. When the first fleet arrived in 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip's orders were clear: establish a penal colony somewhere that could sustain itself. The fleet first anchored at Botany Bay, the site that had looked so promising on paper. But on arrival, Phillip found poor soil, little fresh water, and exposure to fierce winds. So he sailed north a short distance and entered what would become Sydney Harbour, a deep, sheltered bay that seemed almost purpose-built for settlement. There, among rolling headlands and quiet coves, the city of Sydney was born. Sydney's geography defined its destiny. Its harbour, one of the finest natural anchorages in the world, became the gateway through which Britain's empire extended across the Pacific. The early colony clung to the shore, dependent on maritime supply lines and the goodwill of weather. The convicts, soldiers and settlers who built it came expecting wilderness and instead found a labyrinth of inlets and sandstone cliffs. Roads were difficult, but the sea offered freedom, so the first Australian city grew like coral around its harbour, expanding in small connected colonies along the water's edge. To the north, another river mouth beckoned. The Brisbane River wound through fertile plains and offered a reliable source of water, rare on the continent's eastern flank. The region began as a penal settlement too, a place of secondary punishment for convicts who reoffended in Sydney. But when free settlers arrived, they quickly recognised the river's potential. Its looping path inland created a natural trade route between the hinterlands and the sea, and soon Brisbane grew into a bustling port. Its subtropical climate, lush by Australian standards, made it both productive and challenging, humid, full of mosquitoes, and green enough to remind settlers that the land had its own agenda. Further south, Melbourne's story was shaped by chance and ambition. In 1835, a small group of settlers from Tasmania crossed the Bass Strait and claimed land along the Yarra River near Port Phillip Bay. The location proved ideal, flat, fertile, and close to the bay's sheltered waters. Within decades, Melbourne had transformed from a frontier outpost into the wealthiest city in the Southern Hemisphere, thanks to the Victorian gold rush. Gold discovered in the 1850s drew tens of thousands of immigrants from across the world. Wealth poured through the city like water through a sluice, funding grand public building, theatres, and universities. For a brief, glittering moment, Melbourne was called Marvellous Melbourne, its boom fueled by the glint of dust in a miner's pan. Across the continent's southern edge, Adelaide emerged from different intentions entirely. It was founded in 1836 as a planned free settlement. No convicts, no penal colonies. Its designer, Colonel William Light, chose the site for its balance of beauty and practicality. A Mediterranean-like climate, a broad plain beside the River Torrens, and coastline open to trade. The city's neat grid and generous parklands reflected ideals of order and civility, a contrast to the harsher realities of other colonies. Its early economy thrived on wheat, wool, and copper, and its temperate weather made it one of the few places in Australia where European crops could flourish without heroic effort. Far to the west, Perth had an entirely different personality, isolated, sunlit, and separated from the eastern colonies by thousands of kilometres of desert. Founded in 1829 along the Swan River, Perth was the most remote British settlement of its time. The river's wide, slow curves provided both beauty and access to the sea, while fertile lands nearby supported modest farming. At first, the isolation was daunting. Supply ships from England took months to arrive, and overland travel across the continent was nearly impossible. Yet Perth endured, its Mediterranean climate attracting settlers who were drawn to its bright skies and easy pace. Over time, its remoteness became part of its charm, a city that thrived on independence, facing the Indian Ocean like a doorway to the world. Each of these cities grew from coastal necessity into distinct centres of culture and commerce. Yet they were all linked by the same logic. The coast was where life could happen. Inland routes were slow, unreliable, and dangerous, while the ocean provided connection, a maritime highway that bound the colonies together and tied them back to Britain. Ships carried everything from prisoners to pianos, news to nostalgia. Even as railways began to crawl inland during the 19th century, the lifeblood of the colonies still pulsed through their ports. The gold rushes of the mid-1800s added a new kind of energy. Prospectors poured in from Britain, China, and America, heading toward the mineral-rich fields of Victoria and New South Wales. Temporary camps turned into towns, and those towns fed wealth back to the coastal cities. Rail lines followed the flow of ore, stretching inland to link mines to ports. You can still trace their legacy today, thin lines of infrastructure running from inland goldfields to coastal capitals, fading into quiet sidings and ghost towns. The cities on the edge grew fat from the labour of the interior. As time passed, the colonial ports transformed into cosmopolitan cities, each with its own rhythm. Sydney became the face of ambition, its harbour, now framed by bridges and opera sails. Melbourne settled into sophistication, a hub of art and sport. Brisbane remained warm and relaxed, while Adelaide cultivated its reputation for order and grace. Perth glowed quietly on the western rim, prosperous yet self-contained. What began as survival outposts had evolved into gateways to the Pacific, the Indian, and the Southern Oceans, each city both tethered to the sea and defined by its distance from everything else. The first Australian cities were born from geography as much as from willpower. They grew where the land allowed and the sea encouraged. Their foundations were laid in sand and salt water, their streets mapped by rivers and tides. Even today, the coast still holds them close, as if reminding them where they began, on the edge of a continent so vast and ancient that its oldest stories belong to the land itself. The tall ships are gone, replaced by freighters and ferries, but the logic remains unchanged. Life in Australia still begins where the waves meet the shore, and from there it fans gently inland until the heat and silence say, enough. Australia's greatest challenge has never been its size alone, but what that size means for connection. Stretching almost the width of the continental United States, yet with only a fraction of its population, Australia feels vast even on a map. But in real life, out on a highway where the next petrol station is 200 kilometres away, or in a town where mail arrives once a week, that vastness becomes a daily reality. It's what historians have called the tyranny of distance, the invisible force that has shaped how Australians live, trade and communicate across their island continent. From the earliest days of European settlement, distance defined everything. The voyage from Britain to Sydney in the late 18th century could take 8 months, depending on winds and luck. Letters were treasured partly because they were so rare, each one a message from a world impossibly far away. In that era, isolation wasn't a concept, it was an atmosphere. Even within the continent itself, early colonial towns felt like small islands of light scattered across a sea of wilderness. Travel between them was slow, difficult and sometimes dangerous. The coastal capitals grew stronger, precisely because the interior could not be reached easily enough to rival them. As the 19th century unfolded, the need to bridge those distances became a national obsession. Roads appeared first, dusty tracks following the routes of bullock drays and horses. Railways followed, their iron lines threading inland toward farms, mines and goldfields. But even the grandest of rail networks could not overcome the sheer scale of the continent. Each colony, before federation in 1901, built its own rail system with different gauges, a small decision that caused enormous headaches. A train from Sydney could not run on Melbourne's tracks without its wheels being changed. Passengers had to disembark, wait and reboard another train on the other side of the border. The problem became a national metaphor, an emblem of how difficult unity could be in a country held apart by distance. The telegraph was the first real revolution. In 1872, the Overland Telegraph Line connected Darwin to Adelaide, and from there to this global network of communication. For the first time, messages could cross continents in hours instead of months. It was a triumph of engineering and endurance. Nearly 3,000 kilometres of wire stretched across deserts, mountains, and floodplains. Workers faced heat, isolation, and insects in quantities that defy imagination. When the final link was made, Australia was suddenly no longer mute. The world could speak to it, and it could answer. Still, the tyranny of distance didn't disappear, it merely changed shape. Moving goods across such space remained costly. Even with the rail and later road transport, fuel, time and infrastructure expenses mounted quickly. In remote regions, building and maintaining roads was an endless challenge. Flooding rains could wash them away, and heat could buckle their surfaces. The single hypnotic highways that crossed the Nullarbor or sliced through the outback are monuments to determination, ribbons of asphalt where travellers may drive for hours without seeing another car. To cross Australia by road is to understand both the scale of its beauty and the fragility of its connections. The arrival of aviation offered another leap forward. Small planes began linking remote communities in the early 20th century, and by the 1920s, the Flying Doctor Service turned aircraft into ambulances for the air. Suddenly, medical help could reach people who lived hundreds of kilometres from the nearest hospital. The sky became a lifeline, carrying not just patients but supplies, mail and news. Today, regional airlines continue that role, binding together towns that would otherwise feel like specks in a silent expanse. Yet the distances remain stubborn. Flights can take hours and weather can ground them just when they're needed most. In the modern era, the tyranny of distance has shifted again, from physical travel to digital connection. The internet promised to erase geography, but Australia's broadband network often feels as patchy as its rainfall. Fibre optic cables follow the coastlines where most people live, while the vast inland still depends on satellite links or long-distance towers. A video call that drops out halfway through is, in its own small way, a reminder of the same old struggle, that thin settlement spreads infrastructure thin too. This spatial challenge isn't only about technology, it affects economics, education, and community life. For farmers and miners, getting goods to port can be more expensive than producing them. For remote schools, recruiting teachers means convincing people to live far from city comforts. Health services must stretch across territories the size of countries. Even postal delivery is a logistical ballet. One letter might travel thousands of kilometres by truck, plane and four-wheel drive to reach a single mailbox. Despite all of this, Australians have found ways to turn distance into a kind of quiet strength. The sense of isolation has fostered self-reliance and innovation. Remote communities learn to fix their own machinery, generate their own power, and solve problems with whatever materials are at hand. There's a distinct humour in it too, a mix of pride and understatement. In outback towns, people might say the nearest neighbour is just down the road, meaning they live an hour away. In the cities, that same hour would barely cover the morning commute. Even culture has been shaped by this geography. The national imagination is filled with images of open roads, wide skies, and the long journey home. Writers and artists often return to the idea of space, its beauty, its loneliness, and the peculiar peace it brings. For all its inconvenience, the vastness of Australia still defines its identity. It reminds people that they live not only on the edge of a continent, but in a place where connection itself is an achievement. Modern infrastructure continues to nibble away at that tyranny. Freight trains now cross the continent in days instead of weeks. Satellites beam internet to desert schools. Tourists drive across the Nullarbor with air conditioning, playlists and GPS. Yet even with all that progress, the horizon remains endless, the silence immense. Somewhere out there, a single road vanishes into the heat, and a sign warns of the next service station, 200 kilometres ahead. The distance still rules, not as an enemy now, but as a quiet reminder of how vast and how remarkable this island continent truly is. Seen from the night sky, Australia looks like a vast dark canvas with a few clusters of golden light around the edges. These glows mark the cities, bright constellations where almost everyone lives. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide shine like pearls strung along the coastline, while the immense interior lies mostly unlit. It's a pattern that tells a story of gravity, not the kind that holds planets together, but the social and economic kind that pulls people toward opportunity. In Australia, the cities are not just settlements, they are magnets, and the forces they generate shape nearly everything about how the country works. Urban concentration here is striking. More than 2/3 of Australians live in just 5 major cities, and almost half the population fits within the broad triangle that links Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. This is one of the most urbanised countries on Earth, yet its cities are separated by hundreds of kilometres of farmland, bush and open plain. That tension between density and distance gives Australian urban life its peculiar flavour, modern and connected, yet aware of how much emptiness surrounds it. The logic behind these sprawling metropolises is what economists call agglomeration. It sounds technical, but it's really simple. When people and businesses cluster together, everyone gains something. Ideas spread faster, goods move more cheaply, and services, from hospitals to coffee shops, multiply because there are enough people to sustain them. The more activity that gathers in one place, the more attractive that place becomes, creating a feedback loop of growth. It's why Sydney's skyline keeps rising, why Melbourne's suburbs stretch endlessly outward, and why each decade seems to draw more people to the same limited space. Sydney, perched on its dazzling harbour, was destined to be a hub. Its combination of deep-water ports, financial clout, and cultural pull has made it both Australia's oldest and most globally connected city. Its economy thrives on finance, tourism, media, and technology, industries that feed on interaction and innovation. Melbourne, meanwhile, balances that energy with creativity and diversity. Its grid of laneways hides cafes, galleries, and universities that have turned it into a centre of education and art. The friendly rivalry between the two cities, which is better, more livable, more authentically Australian, has lasted for more than a century and quietly fuels both. Between them lies a chain of towns and regional cities that form what demographers call the Southeast Urban Corridor. From Brisbane in the north down through Sydney and into Melbourne-Cis orbit, this stretch is where most of Australia's growth happens. Highways, rail lines, and digital cables tie these cities together like beads on a string. Flights between them are among the busiest domestic routes in the world. It's a single economic ecosystem disguised as three separate cities, a mega-region powered by trade, talent, and the irresistible convenience of proximity. Adelaide and Perth, far to the west and south, play different but equally vital roles. They are anchors, balancing the map. Perth, closer to Singapore than to Sydney, has grown wealthy on the back of mining and energy exports. Its isolation, once a burden, now makes it a gateway to Asia. The city has its own rhythm, more laid back, sunlit and self-contained than the eastern capitals. Adelaide, on the other hand, prides itself on thoughtful planning and cultural life. Its wide boulevards, green parks and festivals reflect a long tradition of civic design. While smaller in population, both cities serve as regional capitals, drawing people, goods and services from territories that stretch thousands of kilometres beyond their suburbs. These urban centres operate less like isolated dots and more like nodes in a vast web. Airlines, highways and data networks link them into a single pulsating system. Mining wealth from Western Australia flows east through financial institutions in Sydney. Agricultural exports from South Australia and Victoria move through ports to markets in China and Japan. A student might grow up in Darwin, study in Brisbane and work in Melbourne, all within a single economic rhythm. The connectivity is constant, even if the land between remains mostly empty. There's a certain irony in this pattern. A country famous for its wide open spaces has built a society that thrives on closeness. The cities are busy, multicultural mosaics where people from every continent mingle daily. Walk through central Melbourne or Sydney, and you'll hear dozens of languages before crossing the street. These hubs attract migrants, students, and investors precisely because they are dense, pockets of global energy scattered across an otherwise quiet continent. Yet for all their vibrancy, Australian cities also struggle with their own success. Housing prices climb, traffic thickens, and infrastructure strains to keep pace with growth. Urban sprawl stretches further into surrounding countryside, pushing up against farmland and bushland. In Sydney and Melbourne, commuters can spend hours each day moving between home and work, a side effect of cities that were never meant to hold so many people. Still, few leave. The jobs, schools and cultural life remain irresistible, and even those who complain about congestion often admit that the opportunities outweigh the inconveniences. Seen from above at night, the difference between city and country is almost poetic. The coast glows softly, a necklace of light tracing the continent's edge. Inland, darkness stretches uninterrupted, save for the faint glimmer of a mining camp or highway roadhouse. Each light tells a story of concentration, of how geography, economics and history conspire to gather millions of people in a few select places. It's not that the rest of Australia lacks value, it's that the cities have become the engines through which everything else moves. The pattern, once set, reinforces itself. Businesses locate where workers already are. Universities expand where populations grow. Infrastructure improves where demand is highest. And so the lights along the coast burn a little brighter each year, while the vast interior remains unchanged, majestic in its darkness. Australia's cities are not accidents of convenience. They are products of geography refined by time. The harbours, rivers and mild climates that once lured settlers still dictate where growth gathers. The rest, the financial districts, art festivals, sprawling suburbs, are layers built on that original truth. Together, these coastal cities form a network that keeps a whole continent humming, connected not by proximity, but by purpose. From far above they appear as small, glowing islands in a sea of shadow, reminders that even in one of the emptiest continents on Earth, life burns brightly where people choose to gather. Farming in Australia is a little like playing chess with the weather, a constant negotiation between ambition and reality, where every move depends on water, soil and timing. From above, the agricultural landscape looks like a patchwork quilt stitched across a continent that mostly refuses to be tamed. Great circles of green pivot around sprinklers in the desert. Wheat fields ripple in golden waves across the plains. Along the southern rivers, orchards bloom and vineyards trace elegant curves through the hills. Yet beyond these narrow zones of productivity lies a vast waiting land, too dry, too salty, or simply too unpredictable for crops to survive for long. The secret to where farming works in Australia lies mostly in the presence, or clever capture, of water. The grandest example of this is the Murray-Darling Basin, an enormous network of rivers, streams and floodplains that sprawls across 4 states and the Australian Capital Territory. It covers over 1 million square kilometres and produces around a third of the nation's food. For much of the continent, it is the single most important lifeline. Here, the Murray and Darling rivers, along with their many tributaries, wind through farmland that turns from brown to green wherever irrigation reaches. Rice, cotton, citrus, grapes and almonds all depend on the steady hum of pumps and the glint of canals. Without that irrigation, the basin would revert to the dry woodland and saltbush that surround it. But even this region is fragile. Its water comes mainly from rain and snowmelt falling hundreds of kilometres away in the Great Dividing Range, and its flow varies wildly from year to year. In wet years, the basin swells and floods, filling its wetlands and billabongs with life. In dry years, the rivers shrink, and the competition for what remains becomes fierce. Managing this vast system has been one of the great policy challenges of Australian history. Too much extraction and the wetlands die, too little and farms wither. The result is a delicate balance of water rights and trades, a kind of liquid marketplace where allocations rise and fall with the seasons. Water trading is one of the most distinctive features of Australian agriculture. Instead of owning a permanent share of the river, many farmers own rights to use a certain volume, which they can buy or sell depending on conditions. In dry times, the price of water climbs, and some growers sell their allocation rather than risk a poor harvest. In wetter seasons, the value drops, and the channels run full again. It's a system that turns rainfall, that most unpredictable of gifts, into a kind of currency. And like any market, it can spark both innovation and controversy. For some, it offers flexibility. For others, it feels like gambling with the sky. Beyond the river systems, much of Australia's farmland depends on dryland farming, growing crops that rely only on rainfall. The southern half of the continent, where the climate is cooler and rainfall more reliable, forms the Great Grain Belt. Here, vast fields of wheat, barley and canola stretch across New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. When the conditions are right, these regions produce enough to feed tens of millions beyond the country's borders. When the rains fail, the same landscapes can look like parchment, cracked, pale, and empty. The rhythm of planting and harvest follows a tempo as old as the soil itself, and farmers learn to read it like a language. The scent of the wind before a storm, the colour of clouds at dawn, the sound of rain hitting corrugated roofs after weeks of waiting. In parts of Queensland and northern New South Wales, cotton fields thrive when irrigation is available, their neat rows stretching to the horizon. Elsewhere, sugarcane drinks deeply from coastal rain and river systems, while cattle graze on grasslands that ebb and flow with the seasons. The livestock industry, in fact, occupies most of the agricultural land in Australia, not because it's the most profitable per hectare, but because grazing can survive where crops cannot. Sheep and cattle wander through enormous properties measured in thousands of square kilometres, watched over by a handful of workers and a few faithful dogs. These stations are less like farms and more like small countries with fences. Agriculture here has always been a dialogue with climate, and the conversation is rarely easy. Rainfall patterns drift with ocean currents, especially under the influence of El Niño and La Niña cycles. One year might bring abundance, the next, parched silence. Farmers diversify, adapt and innovate to hedge against the whims of weather. Some use advanced satellite data and soil moisture sensors to guide irrigation, while others return to traditional drought-resistant varieties of crops. The contrast between old and new methods mirrors the land itself, ancient yet constantly changing, challenging yet full of possibility. Climate change adds a sharper edge to that uncertainty. Temperatures are rising, evaporation rates climbing, and extreme weather events growing more frequent. River flows are projected to decline in many basins, and heat stress threatens both crops and livestock. Yet adaptation is already underway. Farmers are experimenting with carbon-smart practices, planting shelter belts of trees, and improving soil health to retain water. The conversation has shifted from controlling the land to working with it, a quieter, more sustainable partnership born of necessity. There are, of course, places where farming works not just by function, but by charm. The Barossa and Hunter Valleys produce wines that carry the character of their soil and sun. Tasmania, cooler and wetter, yields lush pastures and sweet fruits. In the Athestan tablelands of Queensland, tropical produce thrives, avocados, coffee and bananas growing under soft, humid skies. Each of these regions feels like an exception, a small oasis of abundance in a continent otherwise defined by restraint. For all its diversity, Australian farming shares one essential truth: productivity is local, not uniform. A few degrees of latitude, a slight shift in rainfall, or a single reliable aquifer can decide whether land becomes a thriving property or a dust bowl. It's this patchwork nature that makes the country's agriculture both resilient and vulnerable, flexible enough to adapt, but never immune to change. If you fly over the continent at harvest time, the pattern is unmistakable. The coastlines glint with green. The river valleys form ribbons of life, and the drylands shimmer gold. Between them lie vast spaces of red and grey, waiting in silence. Farming in Australia doesn't conquer the land, it negotiates with it season by season, crop by crop. The farmers who work it know that every full dam and every bale of hay owes its existence to chance as much as to skill. And when the evening light falls across the fields, turning stubble to bronze, it's hard not to feel that the balance, fragile as it is, remains one of the quiet wonders of this immense and restless country. Across much of inland Australia, the lights that gleam in the night aren't from towns or farms, but from mines. They appear suddenly against the darkness, a constellation of floodlit machinery, haul trucks crawling like slow fireflies across the desert. In the silence of the outback you can hear a low mechanical hum, the steady pulse of engines working deep into the night. It's an image that captures one of the country's defining paradoxes: immense economic activity without the dense settlement that usually comes with it. Mining keeps much of Australia running, but few people actually live where the wealth comes from. The industry's reach is enormous. Australia is one of the world's leading producers of iron ore, coal, gold, bauxite, lithium, and natural gas. These resources underpin the national economy, fueling exports and supplying industries across the globe. But unlike farming or manufacturing, mining does not require a large permanent population nearby. Most mines sit in remote regions where heat, isolation, and lack of water make life difficult. Instead of towns growing around them, the workers come and go. This is the world of the FIFO, fly in, fly out, workforce. FIFO is as literal as it sounds. Workers are flown from cities like Perth, Brisbane, or Adelaide to mine sites hundreds or even thousands of kilometres away. They stay for a few weeks, working long shifts under punishing conditions before being flown back home for a break. The system allows operations to thrive in places too remote to sustain communities, but it also means that many mining regions never develop the stable towns one might expect from such wealth. Airports spring up near mines, not schools. There are more landing strips than playgrounds, more runways than roads. The rhythm of life is dictated by shift rotations rather than weekends. For some, this lifestyle offers opportunity and adventure, a chance to earn high wages in exchange for weeks of isolation. For others, it's a test of endurance. The camps are self-contained worlds, equipped with everything from gyms to cafeterias, but they can also feel strangely temporary, like floating villages anchored to the ground by economics alone. Relationships stretch across distance, families adapt to irregular schedules, and communities back home depend on workers who are there one moment and gone the next. It's a modern echo of the gold rush era, but with jets instead of horses. Boom towns still exist, though they look different now. When a new mine opens, nearby settlements can swell overnight. Pubs fill, motels overflow, and property prices soar. But as soon as demand slows or global prices dip, the exodus begins just as quickly. Some towns manage to survive these cycles by diversifying into tourism or services. Others fade back into silence, their streets half empty. The local cafe replaced by a row of boarded windows. Australia is dotted with the ghosts of former booms, places that once buzzed with noise and machinery but now lie quiet, the desert slowly reclaiming its space. The Pilbara region in Western Australia offers the most striking example of this boom and bust geography. Stretching across a landscape of red rock and endless sky, the Pilbara produces more iron ore than almost anywhere else on Earth. The trains that haul the ore to the coast are among the longest in the world, some stretching over 2 kilometres, a moving chain of wealth rolling toward ports like Port Hedland and Dampier. Yet the region's population remains tiny. The towns that do exist, such as Newman and Carrother, depend heavily on the mines and the companies that run them. When production slows, so does everything else. Infrastructure too reflects this strange impermanence. Highways, railways, and even entire power grids are built to serve mines rather than communities. Roads lead to extraction sites instead of city centres. Huge desalination plants on the coast pump fresh water inland to sustain operations, while temporary housing complexes rise and fall like tents. It's a kind of industrial nomadism, enormous investment without the permanence of traditional settlement. The landscape is reshaped by machines, not neighbourhoods. For governments, this pattern presents a challenge. Mining generates enormous revenue and jobs, but it does little to populate the interior. Tax income flows to coastal capitals while the regions themselves remain sparsely inhabited. Services such as healthcare, policing, and education must be maintained for small, scattered populations, often at high cost. In some ways, the wealth extracted from the land deepens the very emptiness it comes from, prosperity without presence. Culturally, mining towns have developed a character all their own. They are places of contrasts, camaraderie mixed with transience, grit balanced by the high-tech efficiency. Workers might spend their days operating automated trucks or remote drills worth millions of dollars, then spend their evenings watching the sunset over spinifex and stone. There's a certain poetry to that contrast, humans mastering machines in one of the harshest environments on Earth, while still humbled by its vastness. Technology continues to evolve the relationship between people and the mines. Automation and remote control are reducing the need for on-site workers. In some operations, trucks drive themselves, monitored by technicians in distant offices hundreds of kilometres away. Control rooms in Perth can oversee equipment deep in the desert, a reminder that even geography now bends to the digital age. The landscape hums, but the people controlling it may be sitting comfortably in air-conditioned buildings, far from the heat. Yet despite this efficiency, mining remains intensely physical. The sound of engines, the thud of drills, the glow of molten ore at night. The work is still risky and the environment unforgiving. Dust storms sweep through camps, temperatures soar past 40 degrees, and isolation seeps into the mind. The people who do it speak of a strange affection for the desert's emptiness, of skies so big they make you feel small, and stars so sharp they seem close enough to touch. Mining has always been about transformation, of rock into metal, of silence into industry, of remote into essential. But what it rarely transforms is settlement. The lights of the mines will fade when the minerals do, leaving behind only the faint trace of roads, the skeletons of conveyors, perhaps an airstrip waiting for another boom. In that way, the story of mining is also a story about impermanence, about wealth that comes from places too harsh to keep hold of it. When night falls over the outback, the glow of the mine sites can be seen for miles, pools of brightness, submarineness floating in the dark. The machines continue their rhythm, the trucks crawl along their routes, and the desert listens quietly. By morning, planes will arrive, bringing new workers to replace those heading home. The mines will hum again, steady as ever, their engines echoing softly across a land that even in its busiest moments never feels truly crowded. Australia is a continent ruled by extremes. Fire, flood and heat are not occasional visitors here. They are regular actors in the grand theatre of its climate. They sculpt the land, shape its ecology, and quietly determine where people can live comfortably and where they cannot. Every few years, nature reminds Australians that geography is never tamed, only tolerated. Fire is perhaps the most familiar of these forces. Long before humans arrived, lightning storms would ignite dry forests, turning eucalypt leaves into torches and sending smoke curling into the sky. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians understood this rhythm and worked with it. Through controlled burning, they managed landscapes, cleared undergrowth and renewed vegetation. Small, frequent fires prevented large, destructive ones, a pattern modern ecologists now call mosaic burning. Fire was a tool, a language, and a cycle of life. European settlers brought a different relationship with fire. They built wooden towns, fenced properties, and often suppressed burning altogether, hoping to control the uncontrollable. Over time, the bush responded with the dense fuel loads and thicker canopies, waiting for the right spark. When those fires finally came, they were fierce and unrelenting. Australia's major bushfires have become almost mythic in their intensity. Black Friday in 1939, Ash Wednesday in 1983, Black Saturday in 2009, and the Black Summer fires of 2019 and 2020. The last of these scorched an area larger than many countries, releasing hundreds of millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. It was a season that felt endless, weeks of choking air, orange skies, and a humbling sense that nature had reclaimed control. Despite their devastation, fires are also acts of renewal. Many Australian plants are fire-adapted, even fire-dependent. Eucalypts release seeds only after intense heat, and certain banksias open their woody cones only in flame. The blackened forest floor months later bursts into green shoots and wildflowers. Still, for the people who live at the continent's edges, fire has become an ever-present anxiety. Expanding suburbs push deeper into bushland, and climate change lengthens fire seasons, leaving communities to balance beauty with risk. Then there is the heat itself, an almost living presence that defines life across much of the interior, and increasingly the coast. Heat in Australia is not just a temperature, it's an experience that changes the sound of the world. In summer, air shimmers above the asphalt, cicadas pulse in deafening rhythm, and even the breeze feels heavy. Heatwaves now arrive more often and stay longer than in the past. They test infrastructure, health systems, and patience. Cities like Sydney and Adelaide record nights that no longer cool, and even the ocean itself is warming, bleaching coral reefs that once seemed eternal. People adapt in countless ways, large and small. Homes are built with reflective roofs, shaded verandas, and cross breezes in mind. Air conditioning hums like a national soundtrack. Water bottles and sunscreen are as essential as keys or phones. Yet beneath these modern conveniences lies a timeless truth. The human body has limits, and Australia often pushes them. The line between comfort and danger can be crossed by a few degrees. If fire and heat are slow, cumulative pressures, flood is the opposite, sudden, theatrical and indiscriminate. Rain can fall for weeks without pause, rivers bursting through their banks, sweeping across roads and paddocks. The same river that trickles for years can turn overnight into a broad moving sea. Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria have all seen their towns submerged, houses carried off by the current, and bridges folded by the sheer force of water. After the droughts that inevitably precede them, these floods feel almost unreal. A pendulum swing from thirst to excess. The causes lie partly in global rhythms. Australia's climate dances to the tune of the Pacific Ocean, alternating between the dry El Niño and the wet La Niña phases. During El Niño years, warm waters shift eastward towards South America, drying Australia's skies and baking its soils. Droughts spread, crops fail, and rivers shrink to a chain of pools. Then, sometimes within a year or two, the pattern reverses. Cooler waters pool near Australia's shores, trade winds strengthen, and the skies open. The continent that burned suddenly floods. La Niña years bring green grass and overflowing dams, and occasionally disasters of their own. It's an alternating heartbeat that defines the nation's hydrology and psyche alike. Every generation learns this lesson anew. The same family might face drought that cracks their land one year, and floods that wash it away the next. Cities build levees and drainage systems, but the sheer scale of weather often outpaces the plans. Still, adaptation is part of Australian life. Farmers design paddocks that can survive both parching and drowning. Architects build houses on stilts or with fire-resistant materials. Communities strengthen through shared experience. Volunteer firefighters, neighbours helping neighbours, sandbag lines under a rising moon. There's a strange kind of pride in this endurance. Australians know their continent's moods. They joke about the weather not because it's trivial, but because humour makes it bearable. Fire, flood and heat are woven into the national identity, reminders that this is a land of constant negotiation between people and place. It's a country where one week can bring dust storms, the next tropical rain, where the same soil that burns can bloom. In the quiet after a disaster, when smoke has lifted or floodwaters have receded, The resilience of both the land and its people is visible. Green shoots emerge through ash. Frogs call in new ponds. Towns rebuild, wiser and warier, but still there. The cycle continues, shaped by forces too vast to command, too intimate to ignore. Fire, flood and heat, each a challenge, each a teacher. Together they draw the boundaries of comfort and courage, showing that life on this immense continent has always been about respect for nature's power, its rhythm, and its astonishing ability to renew. When the haze clears and the air stills, what remains is a quiet gratitude for the coolness of evening, a reminder that in Australia, peace is never taken for granted, but always earned. Life in remote Australia moves to a slower rhythm, but when it comes to basic services, healthcare, education, communication, the distances that define the landscape become daily obstacles. For those living hundreds of kilometres from the nearest town, the essential parts of modern life arrive not by road, but by radio waves, airplane wings, and patient ingenuity. The question is never just how to provide care or schooling, but how far it has to travel to reach the people who need it. Few symbols capture this better than the Royal Flying Doctor Service, one of the country's quiet miracles. Founded in 1928 by Reverend John Flynn, it turned the empty sky into a highway of compassion. Pilots and doctors took to the air to bring medical help to cattle stations, mining camps, and Aboriginal communities scattered across the vast interior. In its early days, a single-engine aircraft equipped with little more than a stretcher and a radio represented the frontier of innovation. Today, sleek turboprop planes carry doctors and nurses across millions of square kilometres, landing on dirt airstrips lit by kerosene lanterns, or even the headlights of waiting vehicles. The scale of their work is staggering. Each year, the flying doctors conduct hundreds of thousands of patient consultations and emergency flights, covering distances that would dwarf many countries. In places where an ambulance could never reach, the sound of an engine overhead is a lifeline. It's also a reminder that the most valuable infrastructure in remote Australia is sometimes invisible. Faith in the system that will come when called. The radio crackle that precedes each flight is as steady as a heartbeat. Health services in these regions rely on layers of innovation and cooperation. Remote clinics, often staffed by just a nurse or two, serve communities spread across hundreds of kilometres. Telehealth has transformed what's possible. High-speed satellite links allow doctors in major cities to consult with patients thousands of kilometres away. A stethoscope can transmit heartbeats digitally. An X-ray can be analysed in minutes. Yet for all its progress, this system remains a delicate balance between technology and trust. A broken antenna or a summer storm can silence the connection completely, turning the modern back into the frontier in a matter of moments. Education follows similar contours of distance. The famous School of the Air began in 1951 as an experiment in teaching children who lived too far from any school to attend in person. Lessons were transmitted via radio, and students scattered across the outback would listen in from kitchen tables and verandas, their voices joining through static and delay. In many homes, parents became teachers, balancing cattle mustering with reading lessons. It was education powered by imagination, geography replaced by grit. Today, the same concept continues through digital classrooms. Children connect by video calls, share photos of science experiments done in sheds, and post essays over satellite broadband. Their classmates might live hundreds of kilometres apart, but for a few hours each day the outback feels a little smaller. Technology has narrowed these distances, but it has not erased them. Communication networks in rural and remote areas still face unique challenges. Mobile coverage can fade to nothing between towns, and long stretches of road remain outside any signal. For many, satellite internet provides the only connection to the wider world. though even that can flicker in storms or under the heavy heat of midday. The Australian government's programs for rural broadband have made progress, but the gap between city and bush, often called the digital divide, continues to shape how people live and work. When streaming a movie takes half an hour to buffer, or a video call cuts out mid-sentence, patience becomes as essential as any device. Yet despite these difficulties, remote communities continue to thrive through creativity and cooperation. Many small towns run their own volunteer emergency services, fire brigades and ambulance crews. Locals are trained to handle first aid, deliver babies, and maintain equipment. In a place where the next hospital might be half a day's drive away, self-reliance is more than a virtue, it's survival. And through radio networks and community hubs, people stay informed and connected, proving that isolation need not mean loneliness. For Indigenous communities, access to health and education is tied deeply to country and culture. Programs that bring bilingual schooling or mobile medical clinics recognise that care must travel not only across kilometres but across cultural boundaries too. Remote health workers often blend Western medicine with local knowledge, ensuring that care respects both body and spirit. In these regions, service delivery becomes less about logistics and more about relationships. The economics of travel complicate everything. In a city, a hospital can serve thousands within minutes. In the outback, the same number of people might be spread across an area the size of a European nation. Every kilometre costs, in fuel, maintenance, and time. Roads buckle under heat, aircraft need constant servicing, and supplies must be planned months ahead. Yet somehow, against all odds, the system holds. The letters still arrive, the students still log on, and the flying doctors still appear when the radio calls. What's remarkable is how normal this has become. For many who grow up in remote Australia, calling a doctor by the radio or attending school through a laptop isn't extraordinary. It's just how life works. They speak of driving hours for groceries or waiting days for a technician with the same ease city dwellers discuss traffic jams. There's a quiet pragmatism in it all, born from knowing that perfection isn't possible, but persistence usually is. At night, when the generator hums and the desert ski glows with stars, a small clinic lamp may burn in the distance, casting a gentle halo of light over the red earth. Somewhere, a voice crackles through a radio confirming a flight, a patient, or a weather report. It's a rhythm older than most towns, technology layered over endurance, civilization held together by care that travels. Australia's services at the end of the road are reminders that distance, though daunting, can also inspire extraordinary ingenuity. In these far-flung corners of the continent, connection is never taken for granted. It is built, maintained, and cherished, proof that even at the edge of the map, the human instinct to reach out and help never fades. For more than a century, Australians have dreamed of solving the continent's thirst by simply moving water around. The idea seems beautifully simple. Take the rain that falls too generously in the north and send it south to the dry interior. Draw lines on a map, dig a few canals, build a few pumps, and presto. The outback turns green, the rivers flow again, and the problem of drought is solved. It's a vision that has appeared in newspaper headlines, political speeches, and dinner table debates for generations. But as with most grand schemes drawn on napkins, reality tends to spoil the romance. These great inland water transfer proposals have taken many forms. Some called for vast pipelines stretching from tropical Queensland to the Murray-Darling Basin. Others imagined canals linking the Gulf of Carpentaria to inland lakes, or tunnels diverting monsoon rivers through the shore spine of the continent. One particularly ambitious version from the 1950s even suggested damming northern rivers to create a vast inland sea, a gleaming new lake that would allegedly moderate climate and bring rain to the desert. The enthusiasm was understandable, Australia's climate seems so unfairly distributed that redrawing its hydrology on paper feels like justice, yet nature and physics have never shown much interest in being fair. The first obstacle is elevation. Much of the inland that needs water most sits higher than the coasts that have it. Rivers, unhelpfully, tend to obey gravity. To move water uphill across hundreds of kilometres requires staggering amounts of energy, the kind that would turn any simple pipeline into a national power project. Even if pumps could push it inland, friction and pressure would take their toll. As one engineer once joked, pipes do not climb mountains out of politeness. They demand power, steel and endless maintenance, all of which cost more than any realistic benefit could justify. Then there's evaporation, Australia's great thief of water. Even if canals could be built across the desert, much of their cargo would vanish before reaching its destination. In summer, surface water here can lose more than 2 meters annually to the sky. The hotter the day, the faster it disappears, leaving behind a salty residue and a long trail of disappointment. Covering the canals could reduce losses, but only at immense expense. Using underground pipelines would prevent evaporation, but the pumping required would drain energy budgets faster than the canals lose water. Either way, the math rarely works. Beyond physics and finances lies ecology, a quieter, more complex obstacle. Northern rivers like the Mitchell, Daly and Fitzroy are part of delicate tropical systems that pulse with seasonal floods and droughts. Diverting their flow would disrupt wetlands, mangroves and fisheries that have thrived for millennia. Many indigenous communities rely on those ecosystems for culture and livelihood. To rob one region of its natural rhythm to fix another's is to shift the problem rather than solve it. The continent functions as a whole, and its extremes, dry and wet, harsh and lush, are interdependent. You can't borrow from one without changing both. The energy costs alone are eye-watering. Pumping water uphill over long distances is one of the least efficient uses of electricity imaginable. Even using renewable power, the scale required would be vast. The proposed Bradfield scheme, for example, which aimed to divert northern rivers into the interior, would have needed enough power to run a small city. And after all that investment, the returns would remain uncertain, tied to rainfall patterns that fluctuate wildly with El Niño and La Niña cycles. Some years there'd be nothing to pump at all. Environmental reality aside, there's also geography's quiet sense of humour. Much of the land between north and south is ancient, fractured and inhospitable to major construction. Laying pipelines across thousands of kilometres of desert and mountain would mean battling temperature extremes, corrosion and shifting soils. The maintenance alone could outstrip the benefit. It's no coincidence that the most successful water projects in Australia, like the Snowy Mountain scheme, rely on short, high-altitude transfers where gravity does the heavy lifting. The further you stretch the system, the faster the dream dissolves, like chalk lines in rain. Yet the allure persists. Every time drought grips the south or flood swamps the north, someone will dust off the old maps and declare, "Surely we can just connect them." It's a comforting thought, and it appeals to the same instinct that led people to straighten rivers and build canals throughout history. But Australia's landscape doesn't respond kindly to shortcuts. The distances are too great, the temperatures too fierce, and the balance of ecosystems too intricate. The continent's dryness isn't a flaw to be fixed, it's a feature to be understood. Instead of moving water across impossible distances, modern policy focuses on making better use of what's already there. Smarter irrigation systems, water recycling and groundwater management all offer smaller but far more achievable gains. Cities invest in desalination plants powered by renewable energy. Farmers adopt drip irrigation and crop varieties that sip rather than gulp. Even the concept of virtual water, trading goods that embody water use rather than the water itself, helps balance demand without moving a drop. These solutions may lack the drama of a continental canal, but they work quietly and efficiently, respecting both physics and ecology. The myth of the great inland water transfer endures because it feels heroic, a single, bold fix for a stubborn land. But the truth is gentler and humbler. Australia's hydrology can't be rewritten by force. It must be lived with, adjusted to and worked around. The rains will always fall unevenly, the rivers will always wander where gravity tells them, and the deserts will always breathe heat into the sky. What can change is how people adapt, with knowledge, technology, and a touch of patience. In the end, the country's relationship with water isn't about conquering scarcity, but learning to share abundance wisely. The dream of turning the outback into a garden may never come true, and perhaps it shouldn't. Some parts of the world are meant to remain vast and wild, their beauty drawn not from what we add, but from what we finally learn to leave alone. To call most of Australia empty is to miss its quiet abundance. Beyond the cities and farms lies a vast living library, a wealth that doesn't glint or roar, but hums softly beneath the surface. These wide landscapes hold their riches in silence, rare species, ancient geology, deep cultural heritage, and the simple luxury of stillness. Over the past century, much of this land has been protected in national parks, reserves, and indigenous managed areas, forming one of the largest conservation networks on Earth. What appears from space as untouched wilderness is, in truth, a carefully guarded treasure. Australia's national parks are enormous by global standards. Kakadu in the Northern Territory covers nearly 20,000 square kilometres, roughly the size of Slovenia, while South Australia's Simpson Desert Conservation Park stretches over endless dunes that ripple like a frozen sea. Across the country, these parks form refuges for biodiversity, protecting ecosystems that exist nowhere else. From the tropical wetlands of the north to the alpine meadows of Tasmania, they safeguard life adapted to every mood of the continent's climate. Marsupials, reptiles and birds flourish in niches carved by millennia of evolution. Even in the most arid deserts, tiny frogs and flowering plants burst into life after rain, reminding visitors that barren is often just another word for resting. This network of protected land is also a quiet economic powerhouse. Ecotourism contributes billions of dollars each year, drawing travellers who come not for skyscrapers or resorts, but for the chance to stand in awe. Visitors hike through gorges carved before humans walk the earth, float in coral lagoons, and watch kangaroos grazing beneath ghost gums at dusk. In places like Uluru Kata Tjuta, the attraction is more than scenery, it's spiritual gravity. The rock formations rise not merely as geological wonders, but as sacred places, living parts of dreaming stories that stretch back tens of thousands of years. Increasingly, these sites are jointly managed by traditional owners and park services, ensuring that conservation and culture move hand in hand. This model, Indigenous Ranger programs and co-management, represents one of Australia's quiet successes. It combines scientific methods with traditional ecological knowledge, restoring landscapes through fire management, feral animal control, and cultural monitoring. Country is cared for in both senses of the word, nurtured and respected. The knowledge that shaped these ecosystems long before colonisation is now being recognised as essential to their future. In the deserts, rangers use ancient fire practices to create mosaic burns that prevent destructive wildfires. In coastal areas, they monitor sea turtle nesting and manage invasive species. The result is a conservation network that is not only vast but deeply rooted in understanding. For visitors, part of the magic lies in what these places lack: noise, haste, and crowding. In a world that rarely stands still, the Australian wilderness offers something increasingly rare: quiet. Remote parks like the Flinders Ranges or Purnululu are as much about sound as sight. At night, the silence deepens until you can hear your own pulse, and the Milky Way reveals itself in staggering clarity. Australia's dry, unpolluted air and low population density have made it a haven for stargazing. Several regions are now certified dark sky reserves, drawing astrophotographers and dreamers who travel halfway around the world to see a sky untouched by electric glow. The absence of city light becomes paradoxically a form of wealth. Even within more accessible areas, these protected lands offer refuge not only for wildlife, but for people weary of noise. National parks act as a kind of open-air therapy, places to breathe, to walk, and to remember what space feels like. Trails wind through eucalyptus forests scented with resin and dust, leading to waterfalls that seem secret even when signposted. Campers wake to kookaburras laughing at sunrise, and at dusk, wallabies move quietly through the scrub. Every park has its rhythm, its own slow heartbeat. Economically, the benefits ripple outward. Small towns near park boundaries thrive on tourism, from guided hikes and eco-lodges to indigenous cultural tours. Local artists draw inspiration from the landscapes, turning sandstone hues and desert textures into paintings, textiles, and music. And yet, for all the activity, the essence of these places remains their stillness. Visitors leave lighter, quieter, changed by contact with a land that asks nothing more than attention. Conservation in Australia is not without its challenges. Introduced species, from feral cats and foxes to cane toads and camels, continue to threaten native wildlife. Climate change alters rainfall and fire regimes, testing ecosystems already finely balanced. Coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, drought-stressed forests, and shrinking wetlands are reminders that even vastness cannot guarantee safety. Yet there is resilience here. Many species and habitats recover when given time and care, proof that protection works when sustained by both science and respect. Ultimately, these parks remind Australians that emptiness is an illusion. What may seem like endless scrub or desert from a distance is, on closer inspection, layered with life, meaning and memory. Each grain of sand, each ancient rock art site, each bird call is part of a living archive. By setting these places aside, the nation preserves not just biodiversity but identity. A record of how land and people coexist when ambition yields to stewardship. When night falls across the outback, the air cools and the horizon glows faintly under the constellations of the Southern Cross. Campfires burn low, voices fade, and the land returns to its own rhythm. In that stillness, the so-called empty spaces reveal their true value. Quiet, enduring, and infinitely rich. The silence itself is the wealth, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable places in the world are those left to simply be. Most of Australia's story takes place along its edges, not just geographically, but socially. The country's population hugs the coastline like a tide that never quite recedes. From the golden beaches of Queensland to the breezy peninsulas of Victoria and the wide bays of Western Australia, people gather where the land meets the sea, chasing light, comfort, and opportunity. It's not just history that anchors them there, it's the way life feels along the shore, gentler, breathable, and bright. The coastal habit began with necessity, but over time it became preference. The early settlers stayed near ports for trade, later generations stayed for the weather. The vast interior, with its fierce summers and long distances, remained the realm of miners, graziers, and adventurers. Meanwhile, the coasts offered a different rhythm: cool sea breezes, fertile soils, and a sense of connection to the wider world. Even now, as cities stretch upward and outward, the pull of the ocean remains strong. The sea breeze each evening feels like a quiet reassurance that no matter how busy or crowded life gets, the horizon will always be open. In recent decades, this instinct has evolved into something almost cultural. Australians speak fondly of their sea change or tree change, the decision to swap city stress for coastal or country calm. It's a migration powered as much by emotion as by economics. Families leave crowded suburbs for towns where children can ride bikes on quiet streets and the sound of surf replaces traffic noise. Retirees trade office towers for verandas with ocean views. Remote workers, freed by technology, settle in small coastal communities where the Wi-Fi is just good enough and the sunsets are extraordinary. What began as a trickle of dreamers has become a tide of resettlement, reshaping regions that once dozed quietly between holidays. This lifestyle migration has created new kinds of towns, hybrids of relaxation and ambition. Former fishing villages now host art galleries, organic cafes and weekend markets. The local baker knows both lifelong residents and newcomers who once lived 5 floors above a freeway. Housing demand has followed, bringing both vitality and challenge. Prices climb as populations swell and the charm that drew people in begins to feel fragile. Many coastal councils now face the delicate task of preserving small-town character while managing growth that seems as unstoppable as the tide. Climate comfort plays its part too. The coastal fringe offers moderation, warm but not blistering, cool but rarely cold. Sea breezes temper summer heat, while winter sun keeps the air bright and mild. The Great Dividing Range along the east coast shelters many regions from interior extremes, creating microclimates ideal for vineyards, orchards and beach holidays alike. Australians, by nature and habit, gravitate toward this pleasant middle ground. The result is a population curve that mirrors the continent's climatic one. Dense, where it's temperate, sparse where it's severe. But life at the edges is not uniform. The tropical north, with its monsoon cycles and humidity, draws a different kind of settler, resilient, sun-hardened, and attuned to the rhythm of wet and dry seasons. In places like Cairns, Broome and Darwin, the air is heavy with salt and frangipani, and evenings stretch long under warm skies. The southern coasts, by contrast, feel almost Mediterranean. Vineyards, sea cliffs, and a pace that invites good coffee and conversation. Across thousands of kilometres, the thread that ties these varied coasts together is a shared ease, an understanding that the ocean shapes not just the weather, but the temperament of those who live beside it. The economic logic is simple but powerful. Jobs cluster near cities, and cities cluster near ports. The coastal capitals, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, hold the lion's share of employment, education and infrastructure. Even smaller regional centres like Newcastle, Wollongong and Geelong owe their growth to a balance between industrial roots and coastal living. Most Australians live within an hour's drive of the sea, a statistic that reflects both practicality and affection. The coast, with its steady supply of work, leisure and fresh air, continues to outcompete the interior's vast silences. Yet the edges come with their own pressures. Rising housing prices squeeze young families and service workers. Traffic follows the newcomers and holiday towns struggle to stay affordable year-round. Climate change adds another layer of tension. Higher tides, stronger storms, and coastal erosion threaten the very landscapes people come to enjoy. Local governments now talk about managed retreat in some areas, acknowledging that the edge is both alluring and fragile. Still, few show any sign of turning inland. The view, it seems, is worth the risk. There's poetry to this national pattern, a sense that Australians are drawn to the places where land breathes. The sound of waves, the play of light over water, the ritual of evening walks along the sand. These are small comforts that shape identity as much as geography. Even inland cities like Canberra and Toowoomba have created their own versions of the coastal ideal. Lakes, gardens, and breezy open spaces designed to mimic that sense of easy air. The lifestyle more than the latitude defines the edge. As the sun sets along Australia's rim, porch lights blink on and the last surfers drift ashore. The breeze cools, carrying the scent of salt and eucalyptus through open windows. Somewhere inland the night remains hot and still, but here by the sea life exhales. This is where most Australians choose to live, on the continent's thin luminous fringe, where comfort, work and wonder meet. The edges may seem narrow, but they hold almost everything: the cities, the dreams, and the soft rhythm of a life lived between land and tide. The Australian interior is often imagined as a single vast emptiness, a flat expanse of red earth stretching endlessly beneath a pale blue sky. But that image, though striking, hides a deeper truth. The inland is not uniform, it is a continent within a continent, full of distinct moods and rhythms. To travel through it is to move between worlds, from iron-rich hills to salt-white lakes, from desert plains to limestone plateaus that look as though the sea only just retreated. These are landscapes of contrast, where silence hums, where distance defines everything, and where even the smallest signs of life carry extraordinary weight. In the northwest lies the Pilbara, one of the oldest pieces of the planet's crust and one of the busiest places in modern Australia. Its iron ore mines supply much of the world's steel, and its scarlet hills glimmer in sunlight like rusted gold. Yet beyond the machinery and rail lines, the region feels almost prehistoric. The rocks here are billions of years old, and fossils within them contain some of Earth's earliest traces of life. The colours shift with the day: deep ochre in morning light, copper by noon, violet under dusk. Towns like Newman, Tom Price and Port Hedland exist mostly because of the ore, but they also serve as markers of endurance in a landscape that seems eternal. Long freight trains snake across the desert, their silver carriages trailing behind locomotives that haul hundreds of thousands of tons to the coast. From the air, they look like threads of mercury stretched across rust-red cloth. Despite its industrial heartbeat, the Pilbara holds a quiet grandeur. Rivers like the Fortescue and the Ashburton flow intermittently, carving canyons and watering paper bark-lined pools that shimmer turquoise against the red rock. In Karajini National Park, waterfalls plunge through ancient gorges, creating oases where dragonflies flicker above still water. For the people who live there, isolation is part of the rhythm, a vastness that both challenges and comforts. Nights bring cool winds and skies dense with stars, and the hum of machinery fades into the chorus of crickets and the steady pulse of heat leaving the ground. Further inland, almost at the continent's centre, stands Alice Springs, a town that feels at once improbable and inevitable. It sits on the Todd River, which for most of the year is little more than a wide bed of sand. When the rare rains arrive, the town gathers along its banks to watch the water flow, cheering as if greeting an old friend. Life here has always been an act of balance between harshness and ingenuity. Alice Springs began as a telegraph station, linking the colonies to the outside world. Today it serves as the beating heart of Central Australia, connecting remote communities across 1,000 kilometres of desert. Its people come from everywhere: artists, indigenous custodians, scientists and wanderers, drawn by the strange magnetism of the centre. The town's cultural richness is astonishing. Indigenous art from the nearby desert communities has reached galleries around the world, its patterns and colours echoing the land itself. The McDonnell Ranges rise just beyond the town, glowing red at sunrise and purple by dusk. Their dry valleys cradle pockets of green, places like Ormiston Gorge and Simpson's Gap, where water lingers in deep rock pools even in the fiercest heat. Alice Springs may be small, but it radiates significance. It is proof that humanity can thrive in the middle of what others call nowhere, provided it listens to the land. Southward lies Lake Eyre, or Katithanda, a place that defies easy description. Most of the time it's a salt pan, vast, white and dazzling in the sun, so bright it feels like standing inside a mirror. The air shimmers and distances dissolve, but every few years when rains fall in Queensland and distant rivers finally reach it, the lake comes alive. Water spreads across the basin, and suddenly the desert becomes an ocean. Pelicans arrive by the tens of thousands, fish appear from nowhere, and the silence breaks into a riot of sound. Locals drive for hours just to see it, knowing the spectacle might not return for another decade. Within months, the water retreats again, leaving crusted salt in a silence so complete it seems holy. Kati Thanda is a reminder that the interior is not lifeless but patient, a land waiting for its rare moments of abundance. To the far south and west stretches the Nullarbor Plain, its name from the Latin for no trees. It's one of the largest limestone expanses on Earth, a flat, pale plateau where the horizon curves visibly with the planet. Crossing it by road or rail feels like travelling through infinity. The Trans-Australian Railway runs ruler straight across it for nearly 500 kilometres, the longest dead straight stretch of track in the world. Drivers on the air highway know the hypnotic rhythm of it. The endless sky, the mirage on the horizon, the feeling of being suspended between time zones. Yet even here, the landscape holds surprises. Beneath the plain lies a honeycomb of caves and sinkholes carved by ancient underground rivers. Along the southern edge, cliffs rise dramatically above the Great Australian Bight, where the land simply stops and the sea begins in sheer walls of limestone. In winter, whales migrate below those cliffs, their dark forms gliding through the blue. Above them the wind smells of salt and sun-baked stone. Each of these regions, the Pilbara, Alice Springs, Lake Eyre and the Nullarbor, reveals a different face of the interior. None are empty, though they may seem so from afar. They pulse with rhythms slower than human time. The turning of seasons, the rise and fall of rivers, the quiet cycles of birth and decay. People who live there speak of an intimacy with the land that city dwellers rarely know. A sense of belonging measured not by proximity to neighbours, but by the memory of sky and distance. The interior teaches a kind of humility. It reminds those who visit that comfort is temporary, that beauty can exist in austerity, and that silence itself can be a form of abundance. The salt pans glint like mirrors, reflecting clouds that may not bring rain for months. The long trains glide like silver threads across the desert, carrying the minerals of an ancient earth toward the coast. The towns persist, small but steady, bound by the same resilience as the land around them. To cross the centre of Australia is to glimpse the continent's heart, vast, dry and full of quiet strength. It doesn't bustle or boast, it simply endures, revealing its beauty only to those patient enough to listen. And when you stand there surrounded by horizons that seem to have no end, you begin to understand why most Australians live at the edges. It isn't that the interior lacks life, it's that its life moves at a deeper, slower pace, one that makes the coastal world feel almost hurried by comparison. Every few years, a new wave of optimism rolls across Australia's map, suggesting that technology might finally make the uninhabitable habitable. Solar farms glitter in the desert sun, desalination plants hum beside the coasts, and fibre cables stretch deeper into remote towns. The old obstacles, distance, dryness, isolation, seem for a moment conquerable. Yet the country has learned to greet such hope with cautious curiosity rather than certainty. The question isn't whether technology can change the map of Australia, but whether it should, and how far it can go before meeting the quiet limits of physics, cost, and comfort. In the endless sunlight of the interior, solar energy looks like destiny. Australia has some of the highest solar potential on the planet. Fields of panels already shimmer outside Alice Springs, in the Pilbara, and across South Australia. feeding power into distant grids through high-voltage lines. In theory, the deserts could generate enough electricity for the entire nation many times over. In practice, the challenge lies not in capturing sunlight, but in storing and moving it. Batteries and transmission lines are improving, but vast distances stretch technology thin. Energy, unlike sunlight, dislikes travelling far. Every kilometre adds a little more loss. The dream of the Sunbelt nation endures, though, because it feels right. A continent of heat finally turning that heat into power. The same logic fuels the rise of desalination. For a land forever balancing between drought and flood, the idea of pulling fresh water from the sea feels like alchemy. Desalination plants now dot the coast near Perth, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, quietly converting saltwater into a steady supply that ignores the whims of rainfall. The process is energy intensive, but with renewable power, its environmental footprint shrinks each year. The technology makes cities more resilient, but extending it far inland remains a fantasy. Pumping desalinated water hundreds of kilometres inland would cost more energy than it saves. The lesson is gentle but firm. Even miracles have a range. Technology's reach is most transformative not in water or energy, but in connection. The rise of high-speed internet and satellite communications has begun to blur the line between remote and accessible. Engineers in Perth can control mining trucks in the Pilbara from air-conditioned offices. Teachers in Darwin can tutor students in desert communities through video links. Remote work, once a novelty, is now a genuine alternative for thousands who prefer open-spaced city noise. A person can wake to the sound of cockatoos, answer emails under the shade of a gum tree, and still be part of a global economy. The same digital arteries that once tied coast to coast now tie the continent to the world. Artificial intelligence and automation have added new layers to this quiet revolution. In the mining industry, driverless trucks and autonomous trains already move ore across the outback with near-perfect precision. Drones survey crops, deliver medicine, and map floodplains. Algorithms forecast rainfall, track bushfires, and even predict coral bleaching. Every year, the continent becomes a little more readable, a little more manageable. Yet these innovations rarely change where people live. They simply make it easier to work where people aren't. Their mines still hum without permanent towns. Their farms still stretch wide and empty, guided by satellites instead of scarecrows. The pattern of settlement, so long defined by comfort and water, remains mostly unchanged. Economics plays its quiet veto. Building infrastructure across immense distances costs dearly, no matter how clever the technology. A fibre cable laid to a single homestead might stretch hundreds of kilometres, serving just a few residents. Roads and airstrips need maintenance, power lines need inspection, and every piece of progress must justify its upkeep. As a result, investment clusters where people already are. The coastal cities grow denser, the interior more efficient but no busier. Technology extends capability, but not necessarily population. Even climate imposes its subtle restraint. Machines may tolerate heat better than humans, but not indefinitely. High temperatures warp metal, degrade electronics, and demand cooling that burns energy. Solar panels work best when they're warm, but not too warm. Batteries prefer shade. In the shimmering expanses of the interior, the very abundance of sunlight can become a technical challenge. It's as though the land insists on balance, offering power, but reminding those who harness it that comfort still belongs to the coast. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss the quiet transformations underway. Remote clinics now use telemedicine to save lives once lost to distance. Renewable microgrids power small communities that once depended on diesel. Startups in desert towns test hydrogen production, battery storage and carbon capture. Even tourism has adapted, with solar-powered camps and electric vehicles exploring places that once lay beyond reach. Technology may not be redrawing the population map, but it's softening its edges, allowing life to thrive in places once deemed impossible. The promise, then, is not a continent covered in cities, but one connected more thoughtfully. The goal isn't to fill the empty spaces, but to illuminate them, to make living and working in remote Australia easier, safer, and more sustainable. The new frontier isn't about expansion, it's about balance. With each solar array, each fibre link, each quiet innovation, the old tyranny of distance loses a little of its grip. And yet there's wisdom in restraint. Some landscapes are valuable precisely because they remain unclaimed. The outback's vast horizons, the desert's hush, the night skies unbroken by light, these are riches not meant to be replaced with suburbs and supermarkets. Technology can help humans exist more gently within these spaces, but it cannot erase their nature, nor should it try. As night falls over the interior, solar farms fade into darkness and communication satellites blink faintly overhead. Somewhere a data light flickers in an isolated control room, monitoring a machine hundreds of kilometres away. It's a small glowing reminder that progress in Australia doesn't roar, it hums. Technology's promise here is quiet, deliberate, and bounded by respect for a land that, for all its harshness, prefers to remain mostly its own. The map of Australia is not fixed. It shifts quietly beneath the weight of time and climate, redrawn not by surveyors but by the changing balance of heat, water and habitability. As the planet warms, the contours of comfort slide southward and upward. Invisible boundaries that once defined livable zones begin to drift like silk in a warm breeze. The challenge of the next century will not be discovering new land, but rediscovering how to live wisely on the one already known. Heat is the most direct and democratic of these changes. It touches everything and everyone. Average temperatures across Australia have risen by roughly 1.5 degrees since reliable records began, but averages tell only part of the story. It is the extremes that shape daily life. Heatwaves now arrive earlier, last longer, and reach deeper into the night, offering no cool reprieve. In cities like Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, urban heat islands magnify the effect, trapping warmth in concrete and glass. The number of days over 40 degrees has doubled in some inland towns, while once mild regions like Perth and Brisbane are seeing record-breaking stretches of heat. These are not anomalies anymore, they are the new baseline. Human bodies and the systems built around them have limits. At certain combinations of heat and humidity, even shade and fans cease to help. Outdoor labour becomes dangerous, transport falters and power demand surges as air conditioners hum in unison. Cities are learning to adapt, planting more trees, reflecting sunlight from rooftops, and designing buildings that breathe rather than trap heat. But adaptation has a price, and it favours those who can afford insulation and electricity. In the countryside, where homes are spaced far apart and infrastructure thinner, heat stress remains a quiet threat. Rainfall, meanwhile, grows more elusive. Climate models predict that southern Australia will continue to dry while the north swings between extremes, deluge and drought taking turns like actors in a play. The Great Rain Belts are shifting south, and the once reliable winter rains of the southwest have already declined by nearly 20%. For farmers, this means tighter margins and greater uncertainty. Dams run low, crops struggle, and rivers like the Murray are stretched thin. The patterns that guided a century of agriculture are becoming less predictable, replaced by a new geography of risk. Where water once flowed regularly, it now arrives in bursts. Where it once soaked into soil, it may now run off too quickly to catch. The coast, that narrow band where most Australians live, faces its own recalculations. Rising sea levels, stronger storms and coastal erosion are redrawing the country's most desirable addresses. Some beachfront properties already see water lapping closer each decade. Low-lying suburbs in Queensland and New South Wales are considering planned retreat the gentle phrase for letting the sea reclaim what was borrowed from it. It is not a choice anyone makes lightly, yet history suggests that retreat is simply another form of adaptation. People have always moved to follow comfort and safety. The alternative is to build smarter, seawalls, mangrove buffers, and homes raised on stilts. Both paths will shape how future Australians relate to their beloved coasts. Some planners talk of densification rather than expansion, growing cities inward instead of outward, to conserve resources and reduce vulnerability. Compact, shaded neighbourhoods use less energy, rely less on cars, and can share cooling green spaces more efficiently. But densification must also remain humane. Concrete can trap heat as effectively as it saves space. The future city, if imagined wisely, will mix technology with vegetation, density with design, so that resilience feels natural rather than imposed. Inland, the story may grow more complex. Some regions could become too hot for comfort or productivity, while others may gain opportunities as climate zones shift. Higher altitudes and southern latitudes, Tasmania, the Victorian Highlands and parts of coastal South Australia, may see modest population growth as people chase cooler air. Already there are murmurs of climate migration, not across borders but within them. A move of just a few hundred kilometres south could mean a difference of several degrees and an entirely new way of life. These small drifts in population might someday change the map as much as gold rushes or railways once did. The ecosystems themselves will respond, of course, long before the census does. Coral reefs face bleaching, forests face more frequent fires, and alpine habitats shrink as snowlines retreat. Mangroves creep further south, while desert plants push toward the coasts. Australia's flora and fauna have always been adaptable. Many have survived millions of years of shifting climate, but the current pace is faster than the past allowed. Conservation efforts are increasingly focused on corridors that let species move with the climate, following the rainfall and temperature bands that sustain them. The map of life, like that of people, is quietly migrating. Technology may cushion some of these transitions. Renewable energy will ease pressure on fossil fuels, desalination will soften droughts, and improved forecasting will help communities prepare for floods and fires. But there are limits even to innovation. Energy can be generated and water purified, yet comfort cannot be manufactured indefinitely. Human geography, like natural geography, still bends to climate's will. The most profound shift may be psychological. Australians have long seen their environment as both adversary and identity, a place of challenge, beauty and resilience. As climate patterns change, that relationship will evolve. People may learn to celebrate moderation instead of abundance, to value shade as much as sunlight, and to see retreat not as defeat but as respect. The future may hold fewer illusions of control and more acts of balance. In the end, the map of Australia will not be redrawn in sharp lines, but in gradients, zones of warmth and water, of ease and endurance, sliding gently across the landscape. Isotherm lines will drift southward like threads of silk, rivers will change their moods, and coastlines will trace new shapes in the sand. The challenge for those who live here will be not to resist the change, but to move with it, to design, build and dream in harmony with a land that, even after all these years, still writes its own instructions in the language of weather and time. To call most of Australia empty is to mistake quiet for absence. From a satellite's view, the continent looks sparse, tiny constellations of city lights clinging to the edges, while the interior lies dark and seemingly uninhabited. Yet step onto that land and the illusion fades. The so-called emptiness hums with life, story and movement. It's not empty at all, just vast, deliberate, and patient in a way that modern eyes sometimes forget how to read. Low population density is not a sign of low value. It simply means that the land sets its own pace. In much of Australia, the scale is so large that human presence cannot dominate, only coexist. Fewer people doesn't mean less happening. It means things happen slower, wider, and often beyond immediate notice. A single cattle station might cover an area larger than a European nation. A national park might protect more species than a small country has streets. The economy that sustains the nation, minerals, food, energy, often flows from these wide spaces. Their silence is not waste, it's function. This vastness also holds the country's oldest human stories. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples have lived with these landscapes for tens of thousands of years, shaping and being shaped by them. Their concept of country dissolves the distinction between land and life. It is not property to be owned, but kin to be cared for. A desert plain can be as full of meaning as a city square, because its significance lies in connection rather than density. Songlines and sacred sites form an invisible map over the visible one, a network of relationships instead of roads. When you walk through the interior with this understanding, emptiness transforms into presence. The quiet becomes a kind of language. Silence itself is a resource here, rare, restorative, and increasingly precious in a world that never seems to pause. The stillness of the Australian interior is not just the absence of sound, but the presence of balance. Wind moves through spinifex with a whisper like soft rain. A wedge-tailed eagle circles above, its shadow gliding across red stone. In that stillness, people often describe a feeling of scale, of being reminded, gently, of their size in the order of things. Far from empty, the land becomes complete. Nothing missing, nothing excessive. Modern life, in contrast, tends to fill space, with noise, buildings, and information. The outback resists that impulse. It demands humility. Here, technology must adapt rather than dominate. Architecture must blend rather than conquer. Remote communities, pastoralists, and rangers all learn the same lesson. Survival depends on respect. You can't rush the weather, outthink a drought, or command a river that hasn't flowed in years. Living with the land, not against it, becomes a philosophy as much as a necessity. Economically, the empty spaces are anything but idle. They produce much of Australia's wealth through mining, grazing, and tourism. Yet their true value often lies in what they protect, rather than what they yield. Biodiversity, cultural heritage, and climate stability. The deserts store carbon in ancient soils and sparse vegetation. The savannas breathe moisture into the atmosphere. The intact wildernesses serve as sanctuaries for species that would vanish elsewhere. Even the so-called wastelands are ecological keystones. To see them as barren is to overlook the quiet work they do for the planet. For the people who call these regions home, emptiness feels different. It is not loneliness, but freedom. Towns may be small, but communities are close. Nights stretch vast and full of stars. Mornings begin in gold light and slow air. Isolation becomes intimacy. With sky, with ground, with self. The roads may be long, but so too is the horizon of thought. Artists, writers, and travellers have long been drawn here not to escape civilization, but to rediscover perspective. In this sense, emptiness becomes a mirror. It reflects back whatever you bring, curiosity, patience, awe. Some find it unsettling, others transformative. The scale forces honesty. Standing in the middle of a plain where the land meets itself in every direction, you realise how much of human noise is optional. You understand that the earth doesn't need to be filled to be full. The challenge for the future will be to keep this vastness intact while still allowing people to thrive within it. Development can coexist with stewardship. but only if guided by restraint. The temptation to exploit every resource or populate every corner runs counter to what makes this continent unique. True prosperity may come from protecting the spaces that remind us of proportion, where the wind speaks louder than traffic and the night sky still belongs to the stars. Empty Australia is, in truth, full of the things we most easily overlook: time, space, silence, and continuity. Its quiet is not neglect, it's endurance. The landscapes that appear lifeless at first glance are busy with unseen motion. Seeds waiting for rain, aquifers breathing beneath rock, histories too long to measure. To walk there is to enter a slower dimension of time, one that rewards listening more than speaking. As the light fades over the Spinifex plains and the horizon softens into dusk, the air cools and the world feels wide but complete. The silence is not hollow, it's generous. In that hush lies the real meaning of emptiness. Not vacancy, but balance. A land large enough for solitude, wise enough to remain so, and alive in every grain of dust that glows under the last breath of the sun. The map of Australia settles into place like a quiet tide. Along the rim, cities glow and breathe, threaded by ports, highways, and lights that glitter at dusk. In the middle, a deeper calm holds, wide as memory and older than story. Together they make a single picture, edges alive with chatter and trade, a centre content to move at the pace of wind and weather. It has always been this way, a balance drawn by climate, water, and time. People gathered where sea breezes soften the air, where rivers meet harbours, where soils and services give daily life an easier rhythm. Farther inland, life asks for patience, knowledge, and deep respect, qualities that never shout, but endure. Across this journey, the pattern has been less a mystery than a conversation with the land. The coast offers moderation and connection, so people choose it. The interior offers scale and silence, so people honour it by the living lightly or passing through. Rain falls unevenly, aquifers hold their secrets, heat draws lines that the body understands even before the mind does. Trade prefers ports, rail follows ore, and fibre cables take the line of least resistance along the bright fringe. None of this is accident. It is the slow arithmetic of a continent teaching its inhabitants how to stay. Beneath every chapter lies country, living, storied and held in care for tens of thousands of years by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Songlines mapped routes long before roads, fire was used to renew rather than to conquer, and water was read in the behaviour of birds, the shape of stone, the taste of wind. The so-called emptiness of the centre was never empty. It was known and named, walked and sung. Any modern map that explains settlement without honouring this older map of belonging leaves out the ground beneath its own feet. So the edges thrive and the centre rests, and both are necessary. Harbours and river mouths turn outward to the world. Deserts and ranges turn inward to time. Mines hum by night and fall silent at dawn. National parks cradle rare species and the quiet needed to notice them. Farms rise and fall with the rain. Towns knit themselves together with radios, airstrips, and goodwill. Technology lends a gentle hand as sunlight gathered into power. Seawater turns sweet, voices carried by satellites. Yet the fundamentals remain. Water still decides, heat still persuades, and distance still speaks in a language of fuel, hours, and patience. There is comfort in recognizing that settlement is not a contest to be won, but a truce to be kept. The coast does not defeat the centre. The centre does not resist the coast. Each shapes the other. Minerals move outward. People and goods move along the rim, stories and stewardship move everywhere. When the horizon widens, the heart often slows to match it. When the sea breathes in, streets feel cooler and minds feel clearer. Geography is not an opponent here. It is a tutor with a kindly sternness, reminding everyone that balance outlasts hurry. If the mind is still turning, let the breath follow the shoreline. Inhale slowly for the length of a small wave rolling in. Pause as it lifts and gathers. Exhale a little longer as the water glides back across the sand. Again and again, letting the shoulders soften, the jaw unclench, the room grow larger by a whisper. Imagine the city lights dimming to a warm hush, porch lamps blinking on, a faint sea breeze finding its way through leaves. Imagine, too, the interior under stars, spinifex stirring at ankle height, a night bird calling once, then quiet. Two halves of the same place keeping each other honest. Thank you for wandering these edges and crossing that wide centre. Thank you for listening to the slow explanations of rock and wind, to the old wisdom of country, to the practicalities of ports and pipes and patient roads. If eyes feel heavy now, let them rest. There will be other journeys, glaciers and deltas, islands and fault lines, cities that grew like reefs and reefs that grow like cities. They can wait. The map will still be here in the morning. If this gentle voyage brought a little calm, feel free to leave a small sign of it whenever you are awake again, a like, a quiet subscribe, a note about where in the world these words found you. For now, there is nothing more to do. Let the isotherms slide south like threads of silk, let the coast breathe and the centre listen. Breathe in and out, and let the last of the day go. Somewhere far inland, the horizon fades to embers. Somewhere along the shore, the tide turns softly in the dark.